This week, Scott Scheferman, principal strategist at Eclypsium, will join us to talk about the BIOS disconnect and vulnerabilities affecting the BIOS Connect feature within the Dell client BIOS. Next up, the one, the only Jack Rhysider, podcaster and host of the Darknet Diaries Podcast, joins us to discuss the journey from network security engineer to podcast host. In the security news, the White House announces a ransomware task force. How much money has Microsoft paid out to researchers via bug bounties? Amazon rolls out encryption for Ring doorbells. How a backdoor in the popular Kiwi SDR product gave root to project developers and more people for years. TrickBot malware returns with a new VNC module to spy on its victims, and some of the absolute funniest quotes about cybersecurity and tech in 2021. All that and more on this episode of Paul's Security Weekly. This is Security Weekly, for security professionals, by security professionals. Broadcasting live from G-Unit Studios in Rhode Island, it's the show where exploits run wild, packets aren't the only things getting sniffed, and the cocktails flow steady. It's Paul's Security Weekly. Can you pinpoint the 10 security gaps in your attack surface that account for 90% of your risk? It's impossible using a combination of scanners, pen tests, breach and attack simulation tools, and manual processes. But attackers can find your gaps. They perform recon and target the weaknesses with the best return. The Cycognito platform sees your external attack surface the way attackers do, eliminating blind spots. Powered by a global bot network, the Cycognito platform prioritizes your highest risk security gaps, integrates with existing workflows, and reduces operational costs. Visit securityweekly.com/Cycognito.
And welcome to the show. This is Mr. Jeff Mann doing my best Larry Pesce imitation because he's sitting by a lake somewhere and he's not here tonight. Let me introduce you to our host, the man with the meat candles, Mr. Paul Asadorian.
Welcome everyone to Paul's Security Weekly. It's episode number 702, recorded on July 15th, 2021, right here in the meat-scented G-Unit Studios in Rhode Island. I want to give a big shout out to our listeners for the meat-scented candles. I'll tell the story once I introduce everyone. Mr. Jeff Mann is here to my left.
In studio for the first time.
That's right. And it smells like Jeff Mann and bacon.
It's or bacon and Jeff Mann. Yeah. Or maybe just Jeff Mann because I love bacon.
That's right. Maybe we're just oozing bacon out of our pores.
It is, but it's a welcome scent for the first time back in the studio for Paul's Security Weekly since March of 2020.
Yes, nice to have you back in studio.
It's good to be back.
Not in studio, unfortunately, is one of my other good friends, Mr. Lee Neely is here with us. Lee, welcome.
Always good to be here. I'm wondering if these bacon jokes are half baked, but it's great to see you guys. Glad one of us made it in the studio on purpose besides Paul, so that's awesome.
Yeah, and so a couple of weeks ago, we made several jokes about meat-scented candles during the interview with, now I don't remember his name off the top of my head. He was really good on the show, too. But Doug, we were just like meat-scented candles worked its way over a dozen times. And so I get into the office on the following Monday, and I've got a package. I'm like, what could, we've been building some computers, so I'm like, what is it? Like, maybe it's the new power supply or whatever. I open up and it's a meat-scented candle, carne asada. I'm like, sweet. And then like the next day or the day after, I get another package. I'm like, oh, maybe this is like my RAM or no, it's more meat-scented candles. Rob Chevelle interview was the interview, 701. And then Sam comes in studio and she's opened up a package and she's like, I think I got another meat-scented candle. So I don't know if you can see them. They're slightly. Oh, there they are.
There they are.
Yeah, so we've got them all lined up.
You've even gotten a new one since I was in here on Tuesday for Security and Compliance Weekly.
This was the one Sam opened, and if I can read it, it's called "I Want to Grind Your Meat Harder Than Carol Baskin Grinded Her Husband" scented candle.
And it smells
like pine. Yeah, it's very good. Very good, Johnny. Very good. Nice. It's pine.
He smelled it all the way in there.
Yeah. So we're right now we're burning the bacon meat scented candle because
it was our favorite.
It was our favorite. I think
we sniffed them all.
Yeah.
Where packets aren't the only things getting sniffed.
We sniff meat scented candles.
There we go.
So Thank you. Our listeners are awesome. Thank you. And now that I've said that,
We'll probably get more.
We'll probably get more meat. We're going to start running out of room on the table pretty soon. We're going to have so many meat-scented candles.
I don't know. It's a pretty big table.
It is.
Challenge.
Well, it also looks like you guys are well setted for fluid replacement testing there.
Yes, we've got several spirits lined up. And in fact, this one right here, was this a gift from Ed Scotus?
This is from Ed Scotus.
Thank you, Ed Scotus. Love you, man.
I visited the Scotus Cryptologic Museum on my way up here on Monday.
That's very nice.
And he was very gracious to say, I don't drink this. Would you take it? And I said, absolutely. I'll drink it with Paul.
Kings County Distillery Peated Bourbon Whiskey.
And it's actually
very delicious.
Very good. Thank you, Ed.
Cheers. Cheers, Ed.
Cheers.
Cheers. It's always awkward silence when we do that.
But we're enjoying it.
Security Weekly Unlocked will be held in person this December 5th through the 8th at the Hilton Lake Buena Vista. Our call for presentations deadline has been extended through July 23rd. So make sure you do that. Submit your presentation, securityweekly.com/unlocked. Submit your presentation there, and early registration is now open. This segment is sponsored by Eclypsium. You can visit securityweekly.com/Eclypsium to learn more. Excuse me. I got so excited.
It's that bacon candle.
It's that bacon candle. If you want to secure all your firmware and all your devices, make sure you visit our fine friends at Eclypsium. Here today from Eclypsium, Scott Scheferman, a.k.a. Shaggy, in the community, is a public speaker, thought leader, and cyber strategist with decades of cyber consulting in both federal and commercial domains. He brings strong opinions and insight into topics such as cyber privacy, AI, ML, or the intersection of all of those. He joins us today for a discussion on vulnerabilities affecting BIOS Connect feature in the Dell client BIOS, among other things, because, Scott, when you come on, we always have interesting conversations. So welcome.
Thanks for having me. This bacon disconnect, BIOS disconnect is quite a story. It's always a pleasure to be on. So let's rock and roll.
So I guess let's start about talking about the BIOS Connect feature, which is interesting for a host of reasons. Just to relate that to personal experiences here, we have a new Security Weekly intern. And one of the first things that I like to have interns do is build systems, get hands-on with things, right? I mean, you could build containers or VMs, but I'm like, you need to get in there in the hardware, build the system from scratch. And both of us have learned so much in doing that and building systems, particularly when you install Linux on actual hardware. You've got things in the BIOS or UEFI to deal with, right? And so there's been some interesting ways which we've updated the BIOS, interesting ways which we've screwed up and had systems not boot because the BIOS and or the bootloader configuration was wrong, which is good learning experience, but also kind of speaks to just how advanced, particularly if we just even focus on the BIOS or UE. I'll call it BIOS, Scott, but we all know most modern BIOSes are UEFI, as you call it, or UEFI. Extensible firmware interface, right? I think is what it stands for. So
what's
interesting
the
that this.
Then?
What's that?
What's the
universal? Is it universal extensible firmware interface?
You did your homework.
Yes. I had to, because now I'm teaching the intern. I'm like, I'm going to look like a jerk if I don't know what this stuff stands for, because he'll be like, what's that stand for? I'm like, wait, I got to think. Power on is it power on self-test? Power on self-test.
It's the best way to learn stuff is to try to teach somebody.
Teach it.
Yep.
So, Scott, tell us about this BIOS Connect feature.
Yeah, well, first of all, hats off for not blaming your intern when your Wi-Fi was messed up a little earlier when we were warming up. So
it's always my fault. Always my fault.
Yeah, that happens in this industry. Blame the intern. So Eclypsium. We have amazing researchers. Mickey and Jesse in particular did a ton of research this last couple of years. And this which is amazing. It's going to be a DEF CON talk as well this year with more details to follow, a demo, some really cool information about the Buffalo overflows that they discovered, etc. So, we're a small company, but we're mighty. The BIOS disconnect vulnerability is something that kind of, took the industry by storm, if you will, because you have this feature, like you said, in the BIOS. It's meant to be helpful. It's meant to help end users trapped at home during COVID, quarantine periods, to be able to do something if they need to restore their operating system or flash their BIOS. And these are two things that are hard for users, right? And for enterprises alike. So they build this functionality in the UEFI or in the BIOS, and or to work with the BIOS, I should say. And it's just interesting because it's meant to be helpful, but like many things that are helpful in cyberspace, it ends up being vulnerable with poor implementations and with buffer overflows and with issues that allow an attacker to be able to be a person in the middle and be able to intercept a request to Dell's update server via this feature, this BIOS Connect feature, and then send anything malicious back to that process, and that process will process it, will execute it. So you can send all sorts of things like a firmware implant, or like malicious code, or like something that will brick the BIOS and the device at the motherboard level. So there's all sorts of evilness that you can do, of course, once you're at that level as an attacker. And I think we've all had this conversation before about why an attacker likes to be in that position as an attacker underneath the operating system and booting ahead of the operating system and having omnipotence and having the ability to modify the operating system and all the security controls on that operating system and things like credential guard or whatever else they want to modify, right? So it's interesting because it's got not old bugs, but bugs that you would have seen even 15 years ago with TLS, as TLS went through its iterative improvement cycle. This is just a poor implementation of it, where it trusts this. It'll trust the cert that you've sent it, and it doesn't matter which cert, as long as it's from the same CA that it's meant to trust. It trusts anything that you send to it, and as a result, it processes and executes the binary that the person in the middle would send to it. That's kind of the short summary of BIOS disconnect and its folly.
Is the system booted when this happens, or does this happen pre-OS startup, or
this
like both?
This is one of those, I'm hard down, I'm freaking out, I'm pulling out my hair, I use my phone to go to the internet, and it says hit F12 when you're booting up, and as the end user, you do that, and now you're in this kind of land where you can do things like restore your operating system, and or flash, or update the firmware if you need to.
I gotcha.
Yeah.
So from an attacker standpoint, the system has to be in a pre-boot or early boot state, like before the kernel's loaded in the operating system, essentially.
Yeah, that's both the advantage for the attacker. Ironically, we can talk about that when it comes to things like BitLocker, but it's also the kind of the one hurdle an attacker needs to overcome, which is to wait for or social engineer and instigate that moment when a user does initiate this process. There is some talk about whether there are ways to maybe automate this or force this to happen. There are some evil scenarios like, you need a reboot, right? To kind of do this off. So what if you did something evil? This is really evil, and this is not going to happen in the wild. So this is just for fun. But like, what if like the night before Patch Tuesday, because everybody's going to have to maybe reboot, you do something that modifies the operating system and breaks it, so that the user tries to reboot after Patch Tuesday when they reboot, and they can't. But the pretext for them is Patch Tuesday. Oh, it must have been the patches from Microsoft that bricked my device. So now they hit F12 like they're meant to do, and now they're off and running.
Yeah,
so
I would like delete the EFI file system, right? Because I think the system would still be running at that point. But if you delete the partition that holds the EFI, when that system reboots, that's essentially your boot record, right? For lack of a better term. And the BIOS is going to go, I don't know how to boot this system. Like, just not booting. And then the system user's going to hit F12 or whatever. And yeah, that's one way to force it. At that point,
the user and the machine freaks out, and you instigate this process. But the other thing is, like, you can just wait for any kind of reboot or any kind of time that the user needs to do this process, right? So think about like in the COVID scenario where everybody's working remotely, especially now.
Yeah.
If you have an issue at home, you might have to use this process to get back up and running for small, medium size enterprises that don't have alternative means to get a user back up and running, right? Some third party.
Scott, does the computer reach out even if a user doesn't press a key in the boot up process?
I don't know. That's a great question. I don't know.
That's interesting.
Yeah. I mean, it certainly can. Like, the UEFI at the BIOS level has its own network stack that's independent of the operating system.
Right.
I don't think that is active when the operating system is. is booted, right? Is
right.
live.
That's correct. Yeah.
Yeah.
At least that's the way I understand it.
Sure. Exactly. So the funny on the upside for the attacker, like when you go through this process, Dell recommends, for example, they require that you disable BitLocker. So here you have this scenario where you're disabling the one control that could have prevented malicious code residing in the BIOS from attacking the operating system or attacking secrets on the hard drive, etc. And so you have to, they ask you disable BitLocker when you do BIOS Connect's update process. So that one mitigating control is no longer in play right at the precise moment where it is such that it makes the operating system now vulnerable to a malicious implant.
That's crazy.
Well, I thought I also read that when you disable BitLocker, it's disabled until the following reboot. So if you're, I'll get back to rebooting later, you could be disabled for a while.
Yeah, and it doesn't take much here. So, this was demonstrated, if you will, on a secure core PC. It has secure boot enabled. It has Defender. Those kind of things, those kind of controls, and yet this attack still plays out, right? So a lot of the mitigations that Microsoft and Dell and others have to protect against firmware level threats, really don't apply to this particular scenario because the threat is a part of the update process itself. It's like literally a trusted process, but it has a poor TLS implementation and some buffer overflows that allow an attacker kind of to insert themselves at a very germane or very kind of quintessentially important moment of this F12 process, if that makes sense, right? So it's a little ironic. You got a disabled BitLocker. If you have secure boot disabled, because some people run it disabled, then you don't even need the buffer overflows. But even if you do have secure boot enabled, you can use these 3 buffer overflows to get past that control and still implant the BIOS, right? So a lot of these traditional controls just don't apply. Same with secure core. It's not that we're bypassing secure core in this case, but it's rather it's orthogonal. It's irrelevant. Yeah, that's going to protect your creds maybe to your cloud cloud creds, Active Directory in the cloud creds, etc. But it's not going to protect the operating system from the malicious implant. So all your camera, your keystrokes, maybe your secrets stored on your hard drive. There's lots of evil things that an attacker might do just locally without even worrying about the cloud, if that makes sense. Move laterally.
What did you call that, Scott? Sorry, secure cloud. Not secure boot. What was the other secure?
Secure core.
Secure core. What is secure core, and what does it do? What's the benefit?
It's so if you remember, Windows 10 was pretty cool because it had credential guard, which prevented somebody running Mimikatz to just be able to pull Active Directory creds out of memory. And that was kind of that iteration. Well, the more recent iteration that's kind of rolling out as we speak, and certainly part of Windows 11 and beyond, is this ability to double check, if you will, firmware before it's allowed to run. So even if you have something evil in firmware, it won't allow it to affect this kind of device to cloud trust relationship. So there's additional trust built at that kind of core level. And that's the best way for me to explain it, not being a super nuts and bolts, down to the details kind of guy.
Right. But that doesn't prevent an attacker that controls the BIOS from implanting code that directly interfaces with the hardware, like a keystroke logger, for example.
Yeah, nailed it. Or continuously making the operating system boot up with malware, stealing secrets off the hard drive, logging keystrokes, looking at the camera. There's all sorts of reasons why that's a bad proposition for anybody, including bricking the device. I mean, the same process could be used to kind of brick all the Dells that are vulnerable to this in one environment, and then you're kind of hard down. So let's say you're a ransomware attacker and you want some additional leverage and you start bricking devices just for show of force, which is what a lot of these folks do. They even print out their ransom notes on printers just for the kinetic kind of shock value that it has for certain victims, right? So bricking a device is also in that kind of same realm of potential kind of forward-looking threats scenarios, for lack of better words.
Yeah, I hope there are protections against bricking, but of course, if you control that software, there's a whole host of things you can do. And one of my lessons for the intern, I'm like, when the BIOS is updating it's really important, like when we're updating firmware and other devices, not to have a power outage while that's happening, because that's really bad.
Exactly. Well, you mentioned the bricking kind of. There are some controls around that that manufacturers try to do, but even like if you remember last time we were on the show, I think was talking about the Trick Boot module and the Trick Boot Discovery, also by the same, by Jesse, the same research right here, and Mickey. So the thing about that was, that's malware that these actors behind Conti and Ryuk, especially at the time, October, whatever, September last year, were using to drop those ransomware variants. And that's the exact scenario where bricking something might be bad for the victim. It's also the same actors work a lot with kind of some of the Russian APT actors, APT28, Russian GRU, etc. And those actors also know how to implant in the UEFI via LoJacks, right? And they also are the same actors behind like NotPetya, a destructive campaign based around what? A ransomware variant, right? So it's like, this is very interesting when you put all this stuff together, you try to anticipate and lean forward. It's really important to get ahead of this firmware space. And a lot of people are like, well, you're speculating, or this is FUD, or no, this is why we keep getting our butts kicked left and right. This is why things like SolarWinds will happen and surprise the whole industry, quote unquote, right? And now we got Kaseya going. Like there's this BIOS disconnect feature, I'll pause after this, is interesting because if you think about like Shadowhammer, another supply chain attack where the attackers, however, first needed to compromise the private certificate for ASUS. And then after that, they were able to send signed by ASUS code to the update process and implant that kind of malicious firmware level malware. Well, this is even easier than that. You don't even need to get a private certificate or steal that. You can sign your go to a CA, spend $100, and just use the same CA that the BIOS update feature trusts. And you can get, whatever, stinkycandles.com or whatever, the meatcandles.com, and you're off and running, as long as it's from the same CA. So
yeah, because it doesn't care what domain it comes from, as long as it has a valid certificate from a certain CA.
That's correct, or a set of CAs. That's correct.
Right, I gotcha. Yep. And you also need to man in the middle. And you and I, and we talked about it on the show too, like there's a lot of ways to do that man in the middle attack to pull that off. I mean, it's almost a whole segment in and of itself.
Well, and when it comes to this feature, some of the initial reaction we got from media, from press and media, from our customers, etc., was, well, does an attacker first need to be a man, person in the middle, what we call it these days, right? Man in the middle, person in the middle, and a machine in the middle. And we're like, yeah, it's almost like somebody saying, well, you got to be admin on the box before you can do that. And I'm like, well, yeah, every single incident I ever worked for 3 or 4 years doing incident response, right? Every single time the actor escalated privileges, and on any given Sunday, there's a way to do that. So stop worrying about whether or not the attacker must be admin first. It's the same with man in the middle. It's if you're TrickBot, you already have a man in the middle module, just, because top of mind, TrickBot. There's any red teamer worth his or her salt knows how to do a man in the middle attack. Any edge device that's vulnerable, which all of them are right now, every VPN, every SOHO, I don't know a single OEM that's not vulnerable, doesn't have RCEs coming out the ears, right? So if you're at that edge, you could also sit there and do person or machine, in this case, in the middle. And then the last scenario that is a little bit trickier, but not impossible for a nation state to do, especially ones like Russia and China. But, think about all the DNS and BGP poisoning and route attacks that are going on, where you can, like, even 8.8.8 was, it was like 5-6 years ago, even 8.8.8 was completely poisoned, right? So for a period of like 30 minutes, but still it can be done, right? And that's one of those scenarios where the malicious server, right, that's masquerading as support.dell.com or whatever, could be on the internet rather than on the inside of the enterprise, which would kind of create watering hole type of scenarios. Yep.
There's also the race condition too. If you respond faster on DNS,
yes,
you could do that as well. Yeah,
old school, almost like EtherCap, ARP layer 2 stuff, right, with DNS, 100%, or DHCP servers that serve up malicious tables.
Yeah, so all those attacks are in play. What I also think is interesting, though, is that a lot of folks, I think, are looking at this and, well, how do I defend against ransomware? How do I defend against an attacker that's going to brick my device? And what I was saying earlier in the week was, these are the impacts of the breach, not the cause, right? And I think we're doing ourselves and the world that are trying to secure systems a disservice when we try to talk about how to prevent against, how do you prevent ransomware? Everyone's talking about that. It's like, well, that's just the impact of the actual attack. And, we also talk, how do you prevent a data breach? Well, the fact that someone got a hold of your data and did something with it, that's the impact of the breach. That's not the cause. And I think we need to get down to prevention, right? Preventing that, and before it gets the impact.
Yeah, especially when it comes to ransomware. The thing about ransomware that this whole industry seems to ignore or not want to deal with is the fact that by the time you're talking to a ransomware actor, or you've got devices being encrypted or bricked, whatever,
too late.
By that time, so much of the damage has already happened. You just don't realize it yet. And you're in this compromised position where the actor has the leverage, they have the power, and they control the timeline, the time wrinkle that they're operating with. It's an extortion negotiation. It's an exchange of power. And whether you pay in Bitcoin or you have a mule, or whether you can get your data back because they say they're going to give it back, or that they'll destroy it. I mean, this just came out in the news the other day. A very large, medical situation. I don't need to mention the name. Was compromised, and their statement to the public, their initial statement was, well, we paid the ransomware actors and they destroyed all the data. And there's no known, we're not aware of any impacts. And you're just like, this is 2021. I've been doing this 20, 30 years. How old are we? At 40 years, some of us, right? And we're still, as a human race, don't understand these basic tenets of information assurance and security control of your own device and your own data. And we're trying to push zero trust.
Yeah.
People, it's
I just want to say, Scott, I think all of us are pretty far north of 40 at this point.
I was trying to be nice, right?
Well, I thought he meant 40 years in the industry.
Oh, okay. Yeah. There you go.
Yeah, that's what I was going for. But
definitely are in the 40 years in the industry, industry camp, right? Yeah. It's interesting times we have today. But I also think that when we talk about protecting firmware, that's also protecting an attacker in somewhat of the later stages too. But I think a very important protection, because you're limiting the impact. You're greatly limiting the capabilities that an attacker has, right? I think that's what Eclypsium's really all about, for the most part. I mean, not to say that there isn't firmware that's right on the network, and that might be one of my first steps, right? But it's also, I think, limiting that impact.
Well, yeah. So, look, the way I speak about this, even before I joined Eclypsium, about this whole space is pretty much it's a race against time. And a lot of people don't even measure time. The instant response, playbooks, SOC teams, they go for efficacy, they go for accuracy, they go for visibility, they go for completeness of playbooks. And they often forget to just break out a stopwatch, so to speak, and say, am I actually getting faster at doing this playbook every day? Same with patch management, same with firmware vulnerability management. If you're aware of information, that doesn't do anything for you. If you have perfect device inventory, good job. It might help you in a lot of cases, but it's not doing anything for you to get you ahead of an attacker unless you take an action that matters. And to take an action that matters, especially when it comes to firmware, you have to have high confidence that you've prioritized which devices are vulnerable to which exploitable, vulnerabilities that are being, can be easily exploited in the wild, right? The Trick Boot module comes out in October of last year, and you're like, okay, maybe I need to patch for BIOS write enable on 50% of my devices in my enterprise. Maybe that's important. Maybe when I do forensics on a TrickBot infection, and I'm part of, one of their targeted organizations that they focus on, that I should do forensics at the firmware level too, because they could easily implant at the firmware level? Or should I just rebuild from the cloud and restore from backup, throw a new hard drive in there, and I think I'm good? No, you're not good.
No, because you're good. Yeah, because the storage controller and all the different subsystems are potential points to hide code.
But what I'm hearing,
and they're all about firmware.
What I'm hearing, Scott, is you want people to think.
Yeah, thank you.
And that's, unfortunately, that's a stretch, because, and I blame all of us. I blame the industry. We are too much in tune with the quick fix. What do I have to do to make it go away? What do I have to do to patch the hole? As Paul was referring, very often fix the impact or clean up from the impact without addressing the root cause. And I would argue, and I do argue, that the root cause of all these things are the lack of proper processes and procedures and actually well thought out strategies of how do we do this stuff. Unfortunately, most companies aren't there.
We were talking about that, Jeff, because I was telling Scott when we ran into some issues building computers and such. We also have a lot of AV gear and firmware-based devices. You could call them IoT, but like they're mixers and video switchers and even lighting systems, right? Most of these are firmware-based systems. And I was like, when we first get a device, or when you first deploy a device,
we used to call them appliances.
Appliances, yeah. And that's still a very valid term today. And so when you get an appliance, a device that has something that has firmware, that when you first get it, that's a great opportunity to update that firmware, right? Like it hasn't been deployed yet. The impact to operations is minimal because you haven't deployed it yet. So let's get it on the latest, because chances are somewhere in that supply chain it sat around for some period of time. And most oftentimes when I've gotten a motherboard or any other type of device with firmware, it's out of date by the time I get it. So I update it. And that's challenge one.
Usually it's a couple versions, iterations behind.
Yeah,
right?
it is.
Yeah.
But I mean, that's problem challenge one, right? Challenge two is, how do I keep that up to date? And maybe it's not just that one device. Like we said, I've got a server. It's got 3, 4, 5, 6 different subsystems that maybe need those different patches, right? And that's challenge two. I mean, and we can go on, because now you've got security risk plus operational risk when you're applying these. Because applying these updates also is one of the kind of sub challenges. Is it's a huge pain in the ass to update some of this stuff, and it carries with it not just a challenge, but also an operational risk that if that update fails, it can be very impactful operationally to your organization.
Yeah. And when there's that kind of risk, most administrators don't even want to try it. Mm-hmm. They're hesitant. They'll just let it ride. Yep. What I'm interested in, I'm sorry, let me throw in this quick question. Yes, it's bad. Yes, it's something that needs to be done. But how do you prioritize this pragmatically with all the other things that you need to do?
It's a good question.
Well, it's right in line with that last little dialogue you guys just had, right? Which is, it's hard. The firmware's hard, right? A lot of people they shy away from it either because they don't understand it, or they don't want to hurt the environment. They want to brick a device. Mm-hmm. But the truth is, like, as we've been kind of moving up in this industry, like, up the stack, if you will, building SIM, SOAR, XDR, EDR now, XDR, etc. All that's like at the operating system and network layer and above. Mm-hmm. But it's whether you're talking about an x86 host or you're talking about your most critical security control in a COVID world, which is your VPN appliance. Yeah. These things are getting smacked at the firmware level. Smacked left and right. I mean, even just like today, like SonicWall, you have SMAs and SRAs that are out there that are end of life, and they're still out there. Why? Because you can't turn that device off, to your point. Mm-hmm. You never wanted, there was never a good day to say, I'm going to go patch that SonicWall device. Rather, you say, if it's not broke, don't fix it, mm-hmm. right? Yep. And all the end users are happy. And so by making these kind of decisions, what happens is we condition ourselves to deprioritize the things that are hard work. But the irony is that those same things are actually the things that are the most impactful to the organization when a bad day happens. I mean, there's no such thing as a firmware threat that isn't a bad day, right? That manifests, right? Whether it's TrickBot, LoJax, Mosaic Aggressor, whether it's any of like a dozen VPN vendors getting whacked as the primary point of entry into ransomware as a service gangs, and to stealing, the COVID-19 research, into bringing down manufacturing, oil and gas, hitting, top of the, like all the supply chain acts, like Quanta, all the stuff that's hitting the top of the pyramid of the supply chain, like REvil and all those other groups are doing right now. It's all because you have these externally facing devices. It's like it's 1999 again. I might as well have Netcat and a Clue. You know what I mean? And I'm getting into these organizations and I'm creating accounts on those VPNs and I'm reselling those accounts to ransomware actors. And we're sitting back here thinking, well, I better do my Patch Tuesday. That's not what's hurting you.
Scott, it's interesting, and I'm curious your thoughts on how you keep things up to date on a firmware level that maybe support has run out. And we've all run into these scenarios. Some quick examples. I ran into one. It was a motherboard from the updates were from 2015. I updated it. It was still an update from 2015. I was still behind because, again, we ignore firmware updates. But I brought that to the latest level I could bring it. And I'm like, if no one's released an update for this in 6 years, what are the chances there could be vulnerabilities? Flip that to the enterprise side. I've got a VPN appliance, and I've got my call center. In fact, there was a interview we did on ESW. Rajiv said, I've got my call center is empty in the building I'm in, and all 200 or 300 people are working from home. And if I've got to update my VPN, system, he's like, I can't just do that. That's going to disrupt our business in a huge, huge way. So how do we protect firmware when updating it has those significant either operational risks or maybe it's just not possible because it's end of life and I still can't go replace it until I buy something new, which again requires more operational risk in rolling out new infrastructure.
All right, so I'm going to just say there's two parties involved here. There's the vendor and then there's the consumer, the end user. And on the vendor side, if you look at the Eclypsium FTA devices, one of the lessons learned for that organization was that Eclypsium thought that they emailed all of their customers and said, hey, the product's end of life. Hey, there's a new firmware version. Hey, we're vulnerable. Hey, there's threats in the wild. But those emails actually didn't go out, right? So the industry kind of stepped back and ask, what is the OEM's responsibility to do two things? One is constantly and have a good way to notify customers of necessary updates like this. And two is, should a product be end of life from a security perspective if it still is functional and is performing its role? So a vendor sold you a security control device or appliance. They sold that to you as a security control, and it's not broken. It works for you. But they've chosen at some point to sunset the ongoing security updates and maintenance of that device. That is perhaps something that we should look at as an industry and say we shouldn't be doing that because there are organizations that run on thin margins or that don't have staff or that have hospitals that have patients to save. And so, that's the vendor side of responsibility to look at. On the consumer side, we just did a scan for VPNs the other day on Census or Shodan or something. I can't remember what it was. We found 175 Juniper Pulse Secure devices. And we're like, what's that? Oh, yeah. If 2015, 6-7 years ago or so, there was the co-branded or whatever before they kind of broke off VPN appliance. And there's hundreds of those still on the internet. And that's bad enough. There's 2009 devices we're finding on the internet, to your point. And it makes you say, okay, we need some kind of national edict, some kind of, we need a bully pulpit person to say, thou shalt not run an externally facing device like a SonicWall SMA right now getting hit in the wild, right, with an O-Day, that is end of life. Thou shalt not do that. That is a bad policy. It's a bad practice, and it's inconvenient to switch it over and to bring down business for a second. But it's really inconvenient to be hit as the top of a supply chain pyramid and have all of your partners, thousands of customers, and an entire automobile industry or something else be affected by it. That's way more inconvenient than updating your device.
So I have a full disclosure confession. Never thought I would say it, but I'm going to say it. PCI does not address firmware. And I would venture to say that there aren't a whole lot of regulatory compliance standards out there that even speak to it. So with that in mind, how do companies that are compliance driven rather than security driven, and there are a lot of them out there, how do you approach those types of companies to get them even paying attention and interested in this is something you ought to do?
So, full disclosure on my end, I spent about 16 years doing risk analysis for largely the United States Navy and other agencies. And one thing I'll say about compliance and requirements and meeting those is that no matter how detailed and explicit you think you make the requirement, there's still a subjective aspect to it. And most organizations will say, okay, how do I check off the most boxes with the least amount of money because I'm compliance driven, or in procurement, that's my litmus. Am I doing the most boxes for the least amount of money? And that's how you get these vendors that are like a large platform where everything plugs in because they cross off one box with one vendor and one dashboard. And so it goes. When it comes to firmware, like, yeah, maybe not PCI, certainly not like HIPAA. But if you look at like the latest NIST guidance, or if you go to like other frameworks like MITRE ATT&CK, or if you go to like the DISA and you look at their writing on zero trust, which is all the rage with the not just even before the executive order, but especially now with the executive order. Like if you go to that document, you will see a ton of information, but you can't do a Control F for the word firmware, because this industry doesn't talk about firmware as a security problem. They talk about platform security and device trust or hardware. There's other words you have to kind of look for to say, this is actually a firmware problem, but the industry doesn't call it that yet, right? Same thing with the executive order. They call out the need to define critical software, and they give you 5 criteria, the whole country, 5 criteria to determine what that is. And if you look at those 5 criteria, they literally verbatim, almost quintessentially so, define the very essence of firmware. And, it has the most dependencies upon it. It's trusted and it's privileged. It's the impacts associated with it are great. These kind of criterion fit firmware perfectly, and yet people, you don't find the word firmware in the executive order yet, right? So it's out there. It's in all the controls. If you look at zero trust in like the DISA guidance, the DoD guidance for that, that was largely co-authored by the creator of Zero Trust, whose name right now I'm just blanking. I just did a podcast with him. I'm just blanking on his name. Anyway,
John Kinderaj.
John K. Exactly. So, and if you look in there, you do a Control F for things like platform, and there's these pillars of zero trust, and then there are these matching activities that tell you, if I do these activities, I will be satisfying these pillars. Right. So this is the context of DoD. And many of these activities tie back to platform and device trust and firmware updates and security. Because how do you have zero trust if you can't even trust the device itself? The foundation of trust, where all the certs begin before the operating system loads, it's literally the very nature of zero trust to say I must at least trust my device, let alone IAM and users and everything else.
Well, that's the problem with trust
fine. I'm sprinkling some compliance dust on there. It'll be okay.
The problem with trust is at some point you have to trust something. I mean, I'm not well versed on the concepts of zero trust, other than it sure sounds like stuff we used to do 25, 30 years ago in the DoD. We just
Orange
called it something
stuff, right?
different.
It's hardening concept of least privilege.
But I mean, how many issues have there been over the years that are exploitable, that are based on trust relationships at all sorts of different levels? But everybody falls back on, well, you got to start somewhere with trusting something.
Yeah, we all inherently trust the firmware in our devices.
Right. Yeah.
Well, part of the reason we trust the firmware is because we're kind of forced to.
Yeah. Yeah.
The Eclypsium is literally, if we're doing one thing and we're changing that paradigm, like when in the DoD, there's this thing called like area of responsibility, and within the area of responsibility, you have like something called security control. Do you have the responsibility and the power, the ability to manifest security control around a system or a system of systems? And if the answer is yes, then you own that responsibility entirely. And what the DoD was reluctant to do for many years, but they started doing, unfortunately, was to sign SLAs with OEMs that would say, well, thou cannot have admin on this, whatever, Google search appliance for the enterprise, or thou cannot load antivirus software on this Windows 2000 box, even though it's the year 2010. Right. So they wouldn't allow that. They had the leverage as a DoD agency, a large agency, to say, we're not doing that. They fought those battles. But the average consumer in the normal world, or even large enterprises, aren't able to have control. So that's why they need visibility, so they can at least start holding the vendor accountable and say, I have BIOS write enable on my BIOS, on my UEFI right here. This is a vulnerability that many actors use to implant the firmware, and I cannot fix it without your help. I need you to issue a firmware update, right?
Yeah. What I also think is
you have to take back that control.
What I think is interesting, Scott, is when we talk about that, it's not dissimilar from other types of software too, is that when a product goes end of life and the vendor says, yes, I'm going to give you security updates for that. But if they're not developing on that code chain, they're also not looking for their own vulnerabilities in their own code. Are they relying on someone else to find those vulnerabilities and report them, and then they fix them? And is that too late? Like, how do we fix that problem to really get ahead of when a vendor says this software, whether it be a firmware-based device or any kind of software, it's end of life? What should their responsibility be to actively seek out vulnerabilities? Or they're relying on threat actors, or they're relying on the secure? Who are they relying on to find and report those vulnerabilities?
Well, I don't mean to one up you in that sense, but what I'll do is I'll raise the bar of what you just said. Forget end of life. Let's talk about life. Let's talk about devices that have a support contract, that are like a VPN appliance, the most important control you can practically have at any given moment. And it's completely fraught with remote code execution vulnerabilities, running crappy web code from 20 years ago, with hard-coded passwords half the time, with the ability to escalate from user land to admin, with the ability to literally implant the firmware, to steal creds. I mean, there's nothing you can't do to these devices right now. And yet these are the bedrock of what little perimeter we have left in this entire world. Right? And they're completely blown out. So my question to the whole world, and I don't have the answer, is how is it? It's not like, bug bounty programs, they're not responsible for motivating hackers now to find even more bugs, and that's why we have this problem. I think there's something much more nefarious and deeper at stake here, and I think it's against this context of supply chain attack and China's 5-year plan and a bunch of other things. I don't have visibility into it. You and I won't. But at the end of the day, how can there be so many perfectly created bugs that are practically perfect features for espionage or for device takeover, remote code execution? These are not stumble bugs. These are not just, somebody with a big fuzzer going nuts once they have user land. This is seriously a big problem that we have to figure out. And I don't think anybody has the answer to it.
So you moved me from apathy to tinfoil hat.
Good. That's my goal in life. Everybody, people used to come at me.
I was more fetal position, sucking my thumb, but whatever.
People used to come at me saying, "Man, you got to slow your roll. You're too much for a lot of people, and you're speculating, and it's fear, FUD, and all that." And I'm like, no. You know what this industry did wrong is we started putting our tail between our legs. We accepted defeat. We went on our heels. We assumed the breach, so much so that it informed our strategy as an organization and even our legacy as a CISO. We're so ingrained with assume the breach, hope for the best, be resilient. If you go to RSA, what was the banner last year or the year before? Be resilient. Never mind resilience. How about a proactive strategy that actually gets you ahead of the adversary? How about we actually fix this problem? And, I'm not saying that as a vendor. I'm saying that as somebody who was in the trenches the last 20 years. I've done incident response. I've been responsible for everything from submarines to satellites and the risk associated with all of that. And I even the Navy was making this error at some point. We started saying, well, we need continuous monitoring so we can see when things are bad. And it's absolutely the case. You're not taken away from the detect and respond or continuous monitoring thing. But what happens is when you apply all that resource there, you only have so many human beings that are responsible for security. And there's an opportunity cost principle at play. And if you ask them to be resilient and be really good at that, they will inevitably slow down their patching, get sloppy at prevention, not disable unneeded services, not segment their network, and all the things that you and I and everybody else in this call listening has known to do for the last 20 years that we stopped doing because we're so busy buying alerts.
Yeah, I think it's interesting, the question of resilience and being proactive. I think if you are proactive, you can be more resilient. But to just focus on the resiliency, again, I think that's more of us thinking that dealing with the impact is being resilient. Being proactive is what's going to make you resilient, right?
That's right. Yeah. You can't just wait for boom to happen and then clean up the mess.
And it's
this
hard.
This is what 2020 taught us.
Yeah, and it's hard to do that with firmware, especially, right? Because these are operational risk, like really high operational risk activities. And I think one of the reasons we don't do it is like, I feel like I'm wasting my time because there's nothing actively attacking it at this time, or I'm gonna break something just for the sake of breaking something, right? We don't always think of it that way. Like, we're very reactive. I think it's human nature to be very reactive and not proactive, right? And I think that's something we need to come back to. We've talked about that on the show before, that that's technical debt essentially, right?
Oh, I love that word. So if you look at Mosaic Regressor, another firmware hitting the BIOS of the UEFI, right? Campaign loosely attributed to APT41, discovered October last year or something. And they're like, we found something in the wild. Kaspersky did. And we only found one implant and was only doing some spy stuff, and it's one machine. And the industry kind of forgot about it. Yeah, that's cool, bro, but I don't have to worry about that. You only have one instance. That's not the whole story. What you read about from a vendor with limited telemetry is one thing. Here's the true story. That Mosaic Regressor campaign was leveraging code from 2015 when whatever the vigilante hacker, I forgot his name, stole their code base from Hacking Team, which is a hacker for hire organization in Italy, and posted it to GitHub. It's been on GitHub for 6+ years. And a lot of actors use that same vector EDK implant. Any red teamer can go grab it. Why? Because it's fully documented down to the standard operating procedure level. Even the documentation is available on GitHub. And so, sure, APT41, or maybe it's the Russians, I'll just do a wink, wink, are also using the same vector EDK implant to do a lot of bad stuff. It's open source code. It still works today perfectly so, and the entire industry did not see it for a 3-year campaign.
Yeah, because it didn't affect you at the time. And I think, I'll use a Loki reference, right? I think we all kind of get hung up on glorious purpose. Right? We have to have some glorious purpose to be able to do something in our environment to protect ourselves from these attacks. And oftentimes it's really not all that glorious what you have to do in order to be proactive. I think it's like maintaining a house. We talk about, home security, and I think that analogy just doesn't work for me for a lot of reasons. But I think what works better for me is the maintenance that you do in your home. Like, Jeff, when's the last time you cleaned your weep holes?
My what?
Your weep holes.
My what?
In your windowsills on the outside, there are these 2 little holes on either side so that water can...
I didn't know they had a name.
It's called a weep hole.
Okay.
And it drains out. But if you don't clean them, water can pool in there. You can potentially get water in your house. Most people will let water come in their house before they clean their weep holes. And there's a million analogies in the home, right? Yep. Changing your HVAC filters or whatever the case may be. People oftentimes go to the... you're going to lock your door and then someone's going to break a window kind of analogy, blah, blah, blah. But I like that proactive maintenance, which is often a tough sell to management, a.k.a. your wife sometimes. They want the project that's going to make the house look pretty. And I'm like, yeah, but like if we don't do this before something bad happens, I know it's going to cost us time and resources, but I'm going to prevent those bad things from happening, right?
I like the idea, though, of maintenance as a concept.
Yeah.
Or call it hygiene.
It's my talk would be called weep hole security, right?
But beyond security, hygiene, beyond best practices, beyond regulatory compliance requirements, to be able, maybe something like maintenance, because that's something you could hopefully convince management that the ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure type of thing. This is cheaper, even though it's time consuming.
Yeah. Your compliance in your home is your homeowners association saying you have to do something or you will incur a fine.
Right.
I used to live in a little craftsman house in Southern California, craftsman. It was like 700 square feet, and we over improved it. We did the kitchens, we did the floors, we modernized it, we got all new appliances, and we were like in the 2004, 2005 housing boom. And one day I had to go underneath the foundation because we had some plumbing issues and I had to see where the line was, which way it ran. I got underneath there and the house was practically off its foundation. We had done all the maintenance in the house. We did not do our weep holes. I never even knew those existed until 3 minutes ago.
You're welcome.
But the analogy is profound to me because I remember when I saw the foundation that was both cracked and on some pillars, and the 4x4s were actually also splintering from the foundation shifting.
Scott, you had some vulnerable firmware in your home. I mean, because that's the layer that you trust, right?
That's it.
That you don't often see unless you crawl underneath the house.
Yeah, and who cares about your home improvement and your new appliances if the whole thing is a sinkhole in the end of the day?
Yeah. I think it was some really good analogies, actually.
It's a good one.
So my other thought was, would it make sense to have something like an F-bomb? A firmware bill of materials or some sort of mandate that says you need to go do something and start with the government, with the DoD, tack it on to CMMC. If you're going to do business with us, you're going to come up with a way of checking your firmware on a regular basis.
Yeah, and I think the components of the firmware are important too. I think if there's web server in there that hasn't been updated in 20 years, or an update process that doesn't apply the proper controls and hasn't been updated in 20, that bill of materials, I think, should also include age of things as well, because that's a lot of the issues we see in firmware, right? Those in the panel and listening know that a lot of these issues stem from severely outdated and older software that's been reused, because it's hard to write software in these tiny environments, so we often reuse the code.
Well, it's the same in firmware. In fact, at the end of the day, dropping the F-bomb is no different than dropping the S-bomb, because firmware is nothing more than software stored differently.
Yeah.
And the first time I heard that was via one of our researchers, Mickey, one of the same two guys responsible for this BIOS disconnect disclosure. And it made me think, it's just stored on the hardware, but it has exactly all the same problems that software does with SSDLC, with supply chain. That's all this code comes from Taiwan primarily. I think Dan Farmer, I remember him at DEF CON probably 10 years ago now. He had a list on a slide, and it was all the manufacturers like ASRock and all the BIOS manufacturers. And all of them came from China. And on the servers, all of the BMCs were completely vulnerable, on those devices. And I'm just like, wow.
Yeah, it's an easy thing to overlook. And now, again, working with the intern and updating all these firmwares and installing things, I had to I probably should have drawn it out, but I'm like, no, there's code running in the BIOS, and then I'm like, there's also code in the storage controller. I think it became apparent, you have to hit the right keystrokes when it boots up. I'm like, no, that one gets you into the BIOS. I'm like, this one gets you into the firmware for the storage controller, and that's what we need to be, because we need to rebuild the array. And I was like, it's really kind of interesting to think about it that way, that there's multiple subsystems in there that, again, like you said, I like the analogy that, not even analogy, but description of, it's just software running in a different piece of hardware on the system.
The other thought I'm having, though, is, and maybe this is a stupid question and set me straight, but in the typical enterprise or smaller company, most companies will have service contracts for the software, for the databases, for the applications, and maybe for the hardware, but not always. But I mean, just watching you and the intern build a system the last couple of days, and you're you're Frankensteining it. You're getting a little bit here, a little bit there. Do you probably do know, but what would the average company that's doing that know who to go to look for the firmware updates? If it came as part of a motherboard and they bought a motherboard,
right? And my concern on top of that is, do I need to pay for a subscription to keep some of those updates, right? Because you can buy, I think I was telling Scott and others earlier that you can go buy a rack mount server. I don't know how else you would describe it, but it's more of the server end hardware, which is constructed very differently. They come from IBM, HP, and Dell. And do I need a service contract to update some of the firmware systems on there? Or if I go buy one, Scott, you mentioned small margins and things like that. I want to stand up a lab. The cloud is actually kind of expensive if you want to stand up a lab. Right. For $1,000, I can go on eBay, buy 48 gigs of RAM and dual Xeon processors, and sure, it might be 5 to 8 years old, but guess what? It's going to run 10 to 20 VMs just fine for a really low cost. But now back to Jeff's point, how do I update that firmware? Do I need a service contract? What components are in there? That kind of thing.
So when it comes to firmware and servers in particular, a lot of people don't realize there's a dozen plus operating systems there, not just the UEFI, but like you're saying, HDDs, network interface cards, PCI buses,
IPMI, the power interface,
ACP or whatever it is, ACPI,
or
whatever,
the Dell used to call it DRAC, right? And all the manufacturers have it. It's basically an embedded computer that runs that can power on and off your computer. Those are fun to hack too.
That's right, and you have like baseboard management controllers are even on the internet exposed for devices that cost $250,000 that are like DGX 100 NVIDIA boxes that are 8 cores in a box or whatever. It's an AI in a box processing box, right? And these people are putting those on the internet along with the BMC. And oh, by the way, the BMC had like 9 CVEs that a red teamer researcher discovered because it's on the internet and it shouldn't be. But yeah, I mean. It's amazing the amount of software running underneath the primary operating system, and like 40% of that is like Linux. It's not like some weird assembly code like people think it is. The UEFI alone is as large as a Linux kernel, and it's arguably more complex. I mean, you can run games in it. Has its own network stack like we talked about. It's a playground.
Absolutely.
It's a powerful playground, and it's way before the operating system.
Well, and I would dare say it's an unregulated playground because nobody's looking at it.
Yeah. Well, we hope people look at it, and we hope people turn to Eclypsium.
Nobody's required to look at it.
Yes, exactly. I've seen demos. I love your product. I know you guys are a sponsor and all, but the team that you've assembled and the software that goes along with that from the really smart researchers and developers is really cool, and will help you get your arms around these types of issues. And when I say that, I mean visibility and control, right? Which is really what we lack if we don't have something like an Eclypsium looking at all these systems, giving us visibility, and then giving us some control in a centralized place.
I would sum that whole experience up by saying what our customers love most about us is a lot of it's like the first month or two. They install us, and they, for the first time, they actually get a perfect view of what that risk is we've been talking about this whole time. It's no longer theoretical. It's not unknown. It's already prioritized for you. You already understand the impacts and the threats in the wild associated with those vulnerabilities. And you can say, I'm going to address this risk. I'm going to remediate it, mitigate it, offset it, segment devices that are critical, whatever you need to do to actually register that risk to begin with as an enterprise. And once it's registered, everything flows downhill. All of our customers, they literally, I'm going to dedicate this amount of time and effort for these, this, and we're building the ability to push updates. We got all those VPN appliances we've been talking about. All those are covered at a much deeper level than just like a Nessus scanner. I mean, I can go on and on, but the biggest thing is like register that risk, know what it is, have the visibility, know what the vulnerabilities are, find back doors, right? Implants, supply chain, counterfeits, supply chain threats, etc. And now you can step back and say, I have a problem, and in my vertical, that's important to me. In my mission, that's critical to me. I can't have that device get bricked or go down or be vulnerable or have a persistent threat on there that persists indefinitely in my environment, and I'm not even the wiser.
Yeah. Scott, thank you so much for appearing on Paul's Security Weekly. For folks that want to learn more and protect your firmware, go to securityweekly.com/Eclypsium. Coming up next, fellow security podcaster Jack Rhysider from the Darknet Diaries. Stay tuned. Cybercriminals are using social engineering loaded with urgency and fear to successfully prey on victims, your employees, or your customers. Protect your Office 365 email from today's most sophisticated attacks with Barracuda Email Threat Scanner. It's a free tool to help protect your business from these hard-to-detect attacks. The Barracuda Email Threat Scanner uses artificial intelligence to hunt and eliminate Office 365 email threats. Find the cybersecurity threats hiding in your Office 365 email right now. Get your free email threat scan at securityweekly.com/Barracuda. Well, welcome back, everyone, to Paul's Security Weekly. In our July 22nd technical training at 11 a.m. Eastern Time, you'll learn how guided SaaS NDR enables rapid response. That's with Gigamon. Peter Stewart, Adrian Sanabria, and myself will be presenting. If there was another webcast announcement, I missed. Okay, good. I thought I screwed up my teleprompter. Of course, you can view the entire archive if you missed one of our webcast and or technical trainings by visiting securityweekly.com/on-demand. Joining us now, Jack Rhysider. He's the host of the Darknet Diaries Podcast, a podcast dedicated to telling interesting stories in hacking and information security. Jack worked as a network security engineer for 10 years at an MSSP, got burnt out, wanted to start a podcast and hear about hacker stories. He joins us today to talk about his journey from network security engineer to podcast host. And I could say I'm a huge fan. Jack, welcome to the show.
Hey, thanks for having me. And actually, we did meet once before. It was DEF CON 18. That was my first DEF CON I went to.
Nice.
And I asked a friend, what is there something I should go acquire when I'm there? And someone said, get a copy of some rainbow tables. And I said, well, where would I even find that? And they said, check with Paul's Security Weekly.
Yeah.
So I came up to your booth. You actually had a booth. I'm not sure what you were selling.
Probably t-shirts.
You had nothing on your booth.
Cigars.
You said you were sold out.
Probably t-shirts.
Probably t-shirts.
But I asked you, can I have some rainbow tables? Do you have them for sale? And you brought this huge spindle of CDs out and said, this is the only copy I have and I'm not giving them away.
Well, that's awesome. Well, I've appreciated your contributions to the security podcasting community and our hacker community in general. Jeff was a guest on one of your shows, an episode I greatly enjoyed.
Something I've done and you haven't yet.
That's right. That's right.
Yeah, it was certainly an honor.
Talked about his days at the NSA and stuff. It was quite interesting.
Yeah.
So, Jack, how did you get your start in information security?
I mean, I got a degree in IT, and then from there, I couldn't get a job. But then I went back to school and got my CCNA. And from there, I was able to get a job in the NOC, so just monitoring networks for customers. And just went crazy with certs. Got CCNAs, CCNP, the professional. This is Cisco networking stuff. And then an opening came up for a security engineer. And I didn't really know what that was, but I was like, it has the title engineer. That's been my life goal. I'm going for it. And it was perfect. Like security is where I think I belong, because getting a degree in IT, you learn a little bit about everything. You know, I took one class in Java, one class in Perl back in the day, and one class in Linux, and one class in operating systems. And, you learn a little about everything. And so when I got into security, I had to know a bit about everything. And it was just such a perfect match for me. And then from there, I just went crazy with certs, the security certs, Cisco, security certs and checkpoint certs and Juniper certs and all this kind of stuff. And it was just managing the firewalls and intrusion detection systems and SIEM tools in our customers' networks.
It sounds like you've been in the industry for quite a while. Talked about intrusion detection and checkpoint and things like that.
Yeah, 10 years is how long I spent at that company. So, yeah, it's been a while.
That's awesome. And you do seem to have a very broad knowledge. The commentary that you have during your interviews, I think, is fascinating. You do a great job of breaking things down as your guests are talking about various topics in information security. I'd imagine you drew on your experience as a network and security engineer.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, somebody told me once that if you can explain complex tech topics simply, there's money in it. And I never got it. I was like, what are you talking about? There's no extra money for being able to explain to my team that this is how this, thing works. And I'm not going to go be a teacher somewhere. Mm-hmm. But it turned out that, there is money in it. And, I was blogging, explaining all kinds of things with my blog. I had a blog where I was like, you try to figure out something at work and you can't, and there's no like articles out there that explain this error code. And so I'm going off the map, right? So if I'm doing that and I'm calling up the vendor or whatever and figuring out on my own, I'm blogging about that. How did I solve that? And so there's a lot of those 7 years of blogging before I got into the podcast, where I was getting these complex topics and trying to explain them as simple as I could.
That's awesome. What made you want to start a podcast in security specifically?
Well, I love podcasts, and I was I was looking for the podcast that was, stories of InfoSec. And I at the time I had been consuming pretty much every security podcast out there, right? So I blew through tons of your episodes, and I was listening to tons of things. And one of the guests you had on back then was McAfee, right? And he just went on and on about this story about going to Belize and getting hunted and tricked and trapped and on the run. And I was just so glued to that story, even though it really wasn't InfoSec related so much, but it was, the old InfoSec guy was there. And I was just like, this is so good. Like, how come there's just not more story time of this is what happened to me, but InfoSec related? And so I really like that. And I just really liked shows like This American Life and Radiolab. And I thought, why can't we merge the two of, let's just go into one story for like a whole hour. And I couldn't find it out there. And, the podcasts at the time were either interview based like yours or news based, or just going into like some topics or something, but it didn't really have any story element to it. So, it was just kind of a lack of there being anything out there that I wanted to listen to, and decided to give it a shot.
It's funny that you mentioned Radiolab, because that's what your podcast reminds me of most often. It's like, you should be on NPR. I should be listening to this on the radio.
Yeah, that was a big influence of mine, is like, let's take that concept but turn it into InfoSec stories.
Cool.
But no, I was sorry, Lee. I was just going to ask you, like, finding stories. It seems to me like when I listen to your show, I'm like, how did you even like find that story? Like, did you think that someone might have had that story? Do you find interesting people? Like, how do you discover? I mean, I want to don't give away your secret sauce. Please don't.
Oh, I'm happy to give it away.
All right, then give it away.
Yeah. So, it started out just like you, right? Knowing the people in the industry, who's giving talks, what are the talks on? You already gave a talk at DEF CON, like Jason Street, for example, right? He's given 100 talks at DEF CON, talking about all the ways that he's broken into buildings. And it's so interesting to listen to Jason Street talk. And so I'm like, this guy has to be on the show telling me a story about when he broke into the wrong bank in Beirut, right? It's an amazing story. You're aware of what's in the industry, and you're aware of what stories are out there. And so I started with that, right? I'm tapping on a bunch of shoulders. You already gave that talk here. Can you give it again on my podcast? Okay, sure. Right. So people were sharing things like that, as well as the stories that are out there in public. I was just getting into them and researching and trying to find anyone connected with it. And I love the people who were there for it. I don't want these industry experts or anyone who's just talking at a 10,000 foot view. I don't mind if you're your third day on the job and you were there for that breach. What was going on, right? So like that's what I'm looking for, the people who were there.
Yeah.
And so, as I did that for a while, I started to develop another strategy, which was getting some Google alerts set up. So like one Google alert I have is hacker sentenced. If that shows up in any news article, it means that a hacker was sentenced, right? But let's go backwards. They were arrested. They were found guilty. Then they must have done some sort of crime. What was the crime? What did they hack, right? So when an article shows up, hacker sentenced, it doesn't typically hit maybe your radar, because maybe we talked about that 4 years ago, right? Of this person.
Yeah, like I touch on those sometimes, but I don't often dig in.
Yeah. But for me, I love this slow news type of thing where it's like, okay, now we can go back 5 years, get the beginning, middle, and the end of this story, and we can know everything about it. Did the customer...
Like, who was the dude you interviewed that had the train in the background? That was an unbelievable... That was amazing.
So then that leads to... Once I got big enough people started bringing me stories, and that guy with the train in the background came to me.
Yeah.
Right as he was in the halfway house, so he wasn't even fully integrated back into the world, but he was in prison for 9 years, and he was in the halfway house talking around, and somebody said, "Hey, you got to talk to Jack and share your story with him." So people are coming to me out of prison now with these tell-all stories, and it's sometimes stuff nobody's ever heard of.
Yeah, that was such a real interview. That was really amazing.
That's funny because I wasn't sure if I should add the train, because the train just kept going by interrupting our interview, and I was like, this sucks.
But it added an element of realism, certainly, because here's this guy, he got out of prison, he's in the halfway house, and like it triggers the empathy. Like, I really felt bad for him, and on top, like, just for his general situation, but then on top of, like, this dude has to live in that house where the train is going by all the time. Like, that's gotta really suck.
Yeah, it was weird. Yeah, so now I'm lucky enough that I've hit the luck, like that. There's different kinds of luck in the world, and now I'm lucky to be the guy that's the go-to for these kind of stories. Yeah. And now the stories are just coming out of the woodwork. It's crazy how many stories are coming my way now that have never been told before.
They're engaging, and I make my kids listen to them as well. I'll talk a little more about that. Lee, I know you had a question.
So, you got these awesome hacker stories, and how did you get to a point where you realized you could say, screw the day job, I can do this full time and make a living at it? And what was that transition like?
Yeah, well, I was at that company for 10 years, and they were bought out by another company, new management. The way they were set up, I didn't like, so I was kind of burnt out at the same time. So a whole bunch of changes, and I was like, I had this podcast going for a few months, and the people that were into it were really into it. And it's kind of one of those things that that this could be worthwhile. It wasn't making any money yet, but I knew it, if I was hitting the fans this importantly, like you just said, you make your kids listen to it. Like, what other podcasts is out there that you make your kids listen to? It just, like, stuff like that I would hear made me realize that there's something big to this.
And so, Jack, you crossed over into the dark side that I did as well. And that's a scary jump, where you left your day job and did podcasting full time.
Yeah. I gave it like a 3-month thing where I said, okay, I'll quit the job. And I had one Bitcoin that I bought at $600. Mm-hmm. And at that time, Bitcoin was at $20,000. And so I was like, okay, I'm going to sell my one Bitcoin. It's the only Bitcoin I had. And I sold it. And that gave me like a 3-month buffer to just, let's see if I could work on this full time and make it happen. Like, get some money by the end of 3 months. And if it's starting to make a little, then, maybe I can get by a little bit further. So that was kind of my goal, is 3 months, focus on it full time. And sure enough, by the end of the 3 months, I got my first ad deal, which wasn't much, but it was enough to show, like, hey, I could probably hold on to this and it could just grow from here.
Sure. And so are you 100% ad supported?
Yeah. No, I have a Patreon too. So I've got a shop that sells shirts, Patreon, and the ads.
Awesome. Good.
Can you get a shirt made for each episode's logo that you do?
Almost. Mm-hmm. I do a lot of shirts. I really like just creating all kinds of weird graphics of, like, I don't know, it's just strange stuff. Like, there's this one I have of a person with like a bow and arrow, and they're shooting the arrow, but the arrow is like the USB symbol. And it's just fun to play around with some of these concepts, like a bouquet of flowers, but the bouquet is made of all kinds of network cables and Ethernet cables and power cables and stuff instead of flowers. And so I just like playing with all this art and stuff, and that's what I make the shirts.
So that begs the question, you do your own art?
Well, I come up with the idea, and then I give it to an artist to make.
Gotcha.
So I think I do half the work.
Well, the hardest part has got to be coming up with the concept, the design.
I think so, but you can argue that.
Yeah, and it the skills. Artists have the skills to bring that kind of dream or creative vision to life. So it's a good partnership.
So, if I may, since I was interviewed by you, and I literally was one of those people that walked up to you and said, "Hey, you should. I have a story. You should interview me sometime." Walk us through. I'm curious because all I saw was a few months later you got in touch with me and said, "Let's do it." What happened in the in between? How did you vet me, or how do you vet people?
That's a good question.
In your case, it was Chris Kubeka who recommended I talk with you, and we actually met at DEF CON, the last live DEF CON or whatever, and we talked a little bit, and it was just chaotic there. And I said, I'll follow up with you, and I just didn't get a chance to. And then you came back to me, and I said, oh, right.
That's right. I did say, are we ever going to talk?
Yeah. So, I mean, in your case, I have a researcher that I said, go and figure out what are the good stories. What's the story I should use for Jeff Mann on my show? Because I know he's former NSA and stuff. And my researcher wasn't that good at the time and just reached out to somebody who you knew and asked, and then they reached out to you, and then you ended up just completing the circle and giving me like links to some stories you've already told. And I thought that was great. So I just took those stories.
So you have a researcher that helps you vet your guests and the guest stories, right? Because you don't want someone coming on and just being full of shit.
Yeah, it's almost like a journalism, type of house we've got going. So I've got researchers who get the story, find the story, research the story, fact check after it's written and stuff like that, and that kind of thing.
Jack, you interviewed a young woman who defected from North Korea, and if I had to create a list of your episodes that everyone should listen to, even outside of information security, that probably would be at the tops of my list, and definitely one that I had my children listen to, because I was like, you kids think you have it rough? I'm like, you need to listen to what she's saying right now, because that you guys need to have a world view and look at how things happen outside the U.S. And there are people that are struggling, and it was an amazing story. How did you stumble across that story and put that interview together?
Well, it started at DEF CON. DEF CON has this booth that has the little USB sticks that you shove into.
Yeah, I remember that.
What's it called? Freedom.
Yeah, what is that called? It's essentially, it was, I remembered it definitely. I can picture it in my mind, a big wall where would you put your USB key in a slot, it filled with media and content, and that content would go to North Korea?
Yeah, it's the oh my gosh,
thumb drives for freedom or something. Yeah,
FDFF is the name of the place. But yeah, there was this thing at DEF CON, and it was like, give us your USB sticks and we'll take them to North Korea. And I was like, what is this? And so then there was a Wired article that explained it more, and I was like, oh, okay. And so I reached out to them, and I said I would like to do a show about how you're sending USB sticks to North Korea, because there's tech involved with this, and it's interesting. I'm fascinated with North Korea to begin with, right? So I got to talk with the Human Rights Foundation is who runs that, and so I got to talk to some people at the Human Rights Foundation, and they interviewed, right? So I was like, okay, well, this is great. How you're shipping USB drives to North Korea? That's fantastic. It would be really cool if I could get someone from North Korea that I could talk with, and we can connect you. And so from the Human Rights Foundation, I got a connection, and then that took an extra 6 months because she was very difficult to get agreed at the right time and all that stuff. It wasn't so easy. But that was a big deal for me too, to get someone from North Korea, because I'm very fascinated with North Korea, and I know that's not somebody you could just go reach out to. But this is kind of one of the things that I like to do on the show also, which is and that project's called Flash Drives for Freedom. I just remembered.
Yes.
I like to get people on my show that you typically couldn't just go find and reach out to. And I want to get this kind of like secret world and have you exposed to it. And I really like that aspect of the show as well.
What was it like doing an interview like that? Did you go through a lot of prep, or was she just more than willing to kind of share her story, right? Because she wrote a book, right?
Yeah, she wrote a book, and I read the entire book before talking with her, because I wanted to be as familiar as I could with it. And her book made me cry. Literally, it was really emotional.
Yeah.
And so I didn't want her to rehash what was in the book. I just kind of wanted her to. I knew exactly what questions to ask to get the most impact for my show.
And you must do a lot of research for each one of these then, right? This is a very well-researched our style is very different, right? We're kind of a machine that cranks things out. But yours are a slower release cycle, and there's a lot more research and background that goes into them, right?
Yeah, I mean, I've got to know what questions to ask before talking with these people, and then afterwards, is any of this stuff true that they told me? And it's nice having my background in cybersecurity, so I can kind of sniff some bullshit out of the air right away and say, okay, that's not making sense. Backtrack didn't exist in 2010 or something, Cali didn't exist in 2010.
Right.
So, how do you keep yourself out of analysis paralysis where you're doing infinite research when you don't need to?
Oh yeah, I go down a lot of side roads. I've got too many tabs open, that's for sure. I mean, it's sometimes I do get lost on what's the story here and where does it start and where does it end, and how sometimes there's too many players and I've got to cut people out and simplify the story and all this. It's tricky. I mean, it's part of the storytelling skills that I had to learn as well, of how to keep it, because it's also storytelling for the ear. It's not just storytelling, but you've got to be able to recognize these names I'm talking about when I go back to talking about that person. So if I have too many names involved, you're just going to be too lost and not know who I'm talking about half the time. So yeah, there's just little tricks I have to do to simplify it, but then keep it interesting.
How long on average does it take you to, once you've done the interview, complete the editing process?
Oh, I mean, each episode takes like 50 hours of work.
Yeah.
And as the first 40 episodes I did on my own, but now I've got a team of, like I said, researchers, 2 producers, 2 sound designers and artists, writers. So I've got some other people helping now.
That's awesome.
How's it feel when you listen to your own podcast, or do you?
Mm-hmm.
Well, I mean, that's the reason why I made it, so I could hear these stories. So usually when I send it out to like a sound designer, they take a month and then they send it back, and I try to completely wipe my head of like what this story was and just listen to it fresh. And that's my favorite part of the whole experience is, I get to listen to this, and it's so exciting or something, right? So I'm still into my own show.
Yeah, that's cool. Awesome though. Most people can't get over the sound of their own voice too.
Yeah. So my voice, I really wanted to sound a specific way. I wanted it to sound like Rami Malek and Mr. Robot, right?
Yep,
it's just this monotone, dead sounding thing. And I asked like some voice coaches, what is that? And they said, he's got serious insomnia, that guy. So, that's the trick. So I stayed up till like 4 a.m. to do my first, maybe the first few episodes. And I tried to get really, really tired and then tell it, which is so weird to like think, okay, turn the mic on, be as tired as possible, and then do the story. But that's the stuff I was going through to try to get that voice, but it just wasn't working for me. It didn't turn out the way I wanted.
Yeah.
So it took me a while to find my voice. I just kept copying other people that I liked, the way they talked or the way they did things, and it wasn't quite exactly the same. And eventually I found my own voice and all that. So it was just a lot of playing around with different voices before I figured it out.
I think it's the voicing that to me is the most reminiscent of the radio show.
Yeah.
I don't have a name for it.
It is more like a radio show, which I think is nice.
The NPR show.
Yeah.
The Radio Lab. I'm sorry.
So with Radio Lab, so the first thing I Googled was, how does Radio Lab make their podcasts when I was learning, right? And there wasn't good information out there. I since learned that there's a book called Out on the Wire, which is written by the people who did Radiolab, This American Life, 99% Invisible, Snap Judgment, that kind of thing. And they explain how they do stories. So I did kind of get a glimpse of it. But what they do is they kind of memorize the story, and they get so into it, so far, so deep, and they go through it like a few times, and then they just totally get rid of the script and everything, and they all stand up. And I even hear that Jad likes to put one leg up on the table and kind of look like Captain Morgan for a minute. And then they say, okay, turn the mics on, let's tell the story. And so Radiolab feels a lot more off the cuff and just natural in that sense. And my goal was to sound like I'm sitting down at the bar with you, and I want to tell you this crazy story about this cybersecurity incident. And here's the guy that was there with him that did it. And it's just like this more casual, let's just talk about it like we're at the bar kind of thing. So it's less like news reporty and more casual in that sense.
One of my favorite types of stories, which I've heard over and over again, are stories, and you mentioned it with Jason Street, are stories of physical penetration testing. I thought your story recently with the two guys where one of them breaks his ankle, and I should have said this, kind of a spoiler alert before I said that. But I thought that was one of the best stories, but I also felt bad that I thought the reason it was an interesting story was because the poor dude broke his ankle.
Mm-hmm.
Did you kind of have that sense, like, this is going to be really interesting, but the reason it's interesting because the poor dude got hurt?
Yeah, because this is how I pick stories, though. I pick stories that I think and you think as a listener are going in one direction, but then it just takes a total side turn and it goes totally somewhere else so that you never expected it to go. And those are my favorite stories. And so, my thing is like, here's what we're trying to do, but then here's what happened instead, right? It did not go as planned. And that's how every episode is like that. So, they were trying to do a penetration test, but everything went wrong. Yeah.
But you often, I think probably 100% of the time, nail the elements of a story, right? Characters, conflict, and resolution. And that is a great episode where you introduce the characters, their background, how they're prepping for the thing. Then you introduce a ton of conflict, right? And their struggles, and then the resolution at the end. And I think that formula, I don't know if you were conscious of that formula when you're developing your stories, but you've nailed it every time.
Yeah, it's kind of a slow start to it too, because I do have to develop that character. Like, there's the courthouse episode, and I'm sure a lot of people remember this, where the two penetration testers, I think it was Iowa, broke into the courthouse.
Coal fire, right?
Yeah, it was from coal fire. They broke into the courthouse at like midnight to do a pen test on it. It set off the alerts, and the police called on him, and they got arrested and had to stay in jail for like overnight. It was a big news story because that's just never happened before. Penetration testers get out of jail; they don't have to stay in jail. And so when they finally were able to talk, they were expecting to go straight to this story, but I was like, no, I want to step back and hear some other penetration test stories that you two have done together. Because when we establish how these guys are professional, they're respectful, they know what they're doing, they're very skilled at what they're doing, and here's some other stories. Now when we get to the courthouse one and it all goes wrong, it gives you a lot more perspective into the whole experience, right?
Lee, Jeff, sorry, did you have questions?
Well,
go
ahead, Lee.
No, actually, I was just going to comment. I was just enjoying the backstory behind what he's doing, because those stories are some of the ones that I don't know. I hear them at conferences. I talk for weeks about them. My wife and I both do. We love them, and then just encapsulating the podcast. It sounds obvious now, but it's brilliant that you're doing that. So that's where my head's at.
Yeah, and I was trying to figure out if I should, I'm on the fence of, should I be telling these stories for people like you who are deep into the InfoSec space already and know this story, like everyone's heard this story, or should I tell it to the general audience where they just don't know anything about InfoSec stories? And I've tried to figure out, do I need to pick a side? And I don't think I do want to pick a side. I think I want to continue to entertain people like you, even though you've heard this story. It's fun to say, okay, I want to hear from their point of view. I want to hear that part as well. And that's really interesting for us, as well as being able to deliver it to the common audience.
Well, I think we listen to it from different perspectives. A practitioner would say, oh, crap, that could be me, and learn from it that way. Whereas somebody who's not in the industry is like, holy crap, that's possible? Whoa, how did you not die? Kind of thing. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Which are both cool perspectives.
Yeah, and what I've learned from that is that the people who are not in the industry know a lot more about computers than we give them credit for. Like, these are the people who are like, I don't know how to get my printer to work. And then they're the ones who are like, that was really interesting how they used a Active Directory vulnerability bypass to get traversal through the network. Like, what are you talking about? How do you know about that now? Just because I mentioned it on the show. Like, they know a lot more than we give them credit for.
I guess what I'm thinking is, because I was on Darknet Diaries, and I think, that's, a feather in my cap. It's an achievement. And yet, hearing you talk, I think I'm more impressed with, and what I think you've tapped into is A, it's the storytelling, but B, there's so many people out there that have had stuff happen to them that for whatever reason they're not ever going to get up and tell their story at a conference for whatever reason, and giving them a platform, giving a chance to tell the story. It reminds me of all the times in my travels. I haven't done it recently because I haven't been traveling recently, but I used to like to go to blues bars, and I would hear these amazing musicians that nobody's ever heard of. Yeah. And I'm like, these guys are better than the top, all the big name bands. I go to different music conferences, and you hear all these incredible musicians, but they're never going to make it big because it's a long way to the top if you want to rock and roll. So giving people, regular everyday people the opportunity to tell their story, I think that's probably more impressive than you don't need to go to all the famous known people in our industry anymore. Maybe sprinkle it in once in a while, but they get their platform, they get their chance to talk. The opportunity that you're giving more people to talk, and the fact that they're approaching you and you're researching them and giving them a fair shake, I think that's very cool.
They not only get their 15 seconds of fame, they get their 40 minutes or so.
That's right.
It's weird. Like, some of them are actually putting like their episode number in their Twitter handles and stuff because they're so excited to get the show.
How does that feel?
Yeah, it feels weird. When people, but the thing is that at first I was like hesitant to ask these people, like, these people, like, the worst time of their life. Like, tell me again the time when you were arrested and guns pointed at you and stuff,
Yeah,
and
I thought that with the Coal Fire folks, right? Because I interviewed them and I was like, what was it like to be in prison? I'm like, that was like, I'm digging up like a really horrible memory for them, right?
Yeah. I was really worried about that. And it as it turns out, like, some of these people have never really got a chance to tell us how it feels, tell anyone how it feels to, from the high to the low. How did it feel to hit enter and take down that website, all the way to how did it feel when you saw your dad's face when the cops came to the front door, They never explained all that to everyone, and they feel good. Like, there's something cathartic and therapeutic about telling the whole thing and letting it out, and they actually appreciate, like, the way I get into it and the way that we have the conversation. That they feel like it is a fair. Like, I want the listener, I want the guest to think that I did a fair episode on them, and once that happens, then they feel like, wow, my story was accurately done. And it's to the point where I was even impressed. Like, I learned things, right? So, like, I would interview someone and then I'd fact check it with this or that other thing, and they'd be like, "Oh, I didn't even know that happened." And so they were just, a lot of them are just impressed that their story is told in a nice way that they can then point to and say, "Hey, if you want to know more about me, check this out."
I started listening to the Jordan Harbinger show as a result of listening to your show, Jack. How did you get to meet Jordan Harbinger?
I think we connected on Twitter, and then, I don't know how I figured out how he was like a hacker when he was younger, but when I learned about that, then I looked into him more and connected with him and got him on my show.
Just for our listeners, I think Jordan does a great show as well. Are you also a fan of his podcast?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, he interviews some really interesting people, like just really interesting.
I think the interview where he interviewed the defector from Hamas was one of his best episodes that I listened to recently. That was pretty awesome.
Hey, a question came in on our Discord server. I will just read it verbatim. How did you break out of the InfoSec bubble with your podcast, or was it always outside, or did it just naturally go mainstream/viral?
I mean, one of the things that kind of inspired me earlier as well is there was a talk by Leslie Carhart and Johnny Xmas, who they were on stage and they said, if you want to be like an InfoSec rock star, don't try to come on stage at an InfoSec conference. Try to go on stage at a different conference, like Comic-Con. And if you tell the people at Comic-Con that you're a hacker, then they're going to go crazy and be fascinated with you and interested. And they're going to fill that room. If you give a talk at Comic-Con about how to hack stuff, they're going to fill that room just as much as any other room in there. And so that really intrigued me of like, wow, how, if we can tell these stories to non-tech people, that would be an interesting thing. So that was kind of another thing that I was, thinking about is how does that work? And so, yeah, I didn't know if I don't know if I really tried to break out of I guess I did a lot of marketing on social media as just by posting a lot and being active, not really, spending money, but I also contacted people who have large audiences, right? So big people on Twitter and news organizations and stuff. And I said, hey, maybe you want to publish, tell your audience about my show. You might find it interesting. And some took me up on it, right? So I got posted in the Guardian and some other places like the Boston Globe wrote about it and stuff. So it hit some other news journals. And I think that kind of got me in bigger as well.
Jack, I think that's great advice, though. In the order is important that you got to create something that you've put all of your passion and drive and effort behind, and then don't be afraid to promote it. And like you said, not everyone's going to pay attention to it, but some people will, and that gets you out there. Because I get the question all the time, like, how do I start a new podcast, right? And I was literally behind the scenes watching you do that. I'm like, you've got great content, and you should be promoting it to all these different outlets. And I think you did a great job with marketing.
The way I look at marketing is not like a sleazy thing. It's more of like, I want to get it to the people who want this. And that's my whole goal, is not force it upon people who don't want it, but just get it to the people who do. And how do I figure that out? What conferences do they go to? What chat rooms do they hang out in? These kind of things, and just be there with them.
What are some of your favorite communities to hang out in information security?
Or out of information security?
I think Twitter is my main place I hang out. I was with the Many Hats Club before they closed down, but Discord's got a lot more things coming up. So I have a Darknet Diaries Discord, so whenever I get on Discord, I'm mostly there. But yeah, Twitter is the biggest thing.
Where do you see podcasting in general and/or security podcasting? What's the future hold for us? It's been a wild ride for me, for yourself. Where do you see it going?
I think it's going to continue to grow for a while. I don't like when companies buy it up and make exclusive content on their platform and stuff. I don't think that helps podcasting at all. It just helps that creator and their platform, but doesn't help the place. So I don't like that. I'm more of a free and open kind of person. So
yeah, I agree. I mean, I'm a fan of Joe Rogan, but that's monetarily and maybe popularity wise the biggest example of what you're talking about, right? You can only get it on Spotify. You can only watch the videos on Spotify. You can't watch the full video on YouTube.
Yeah, and I still think even if he made $100 million off of it, I still think it was a bad deal because his was the biggest podcast out there. And if you do the math on how much he could have charged for ads and how many ads he had and all that stuff, I think he was making more than, like, he could make more than that in just a few years or something. It didn't make sense. Like, why would he want to make it exclusive when he could do this other thing? So I think he had some other plan involved, which might have been like, let's see if this thing burns down and then I'm going to walk away with $100 million or something. But right. I don't know. Like, if he can get canceled from that, then it's a good reason for him to quit. Like, he doesn't want to do this forever. He's running out of steam and he just wants to maybe come up with a good reason to get out.
Hey, I have a question to put you on the spot maybe a little bit, Jack, and Paul, I hope you'll forgive me for this, but as a professional podcaster, someone that early on listened to Paul's Security Weekly, and we don't want to be your show. We have our own thing, but what would you tell us as Paul's Security Weekly? What are the good things we do? What would you like to see more of? What would you like to see less of?
Well, when I was getting into podcasts as a security engineer, I was looking at security podcasts. Like, that was my Google search, right? And that was what I was searching in apps and stuff. And so it was easy for Paul's Security Weekly to come up as a security podcast. Like, if I search that term. So because you had that in your title, that made it easy for me to find. And I think that's going a long way. Like you got that. So, yeah, that's good. And yeah, you just do a great job. I don't have any critiques for you. You do a great job finding all kinds of guests and interesting people. And I love the atmosphere you bring. Like you have your own attitude and system.
We have meat candles. You don't have meat candles.
Yeah, don't.
And brown liquor.
Yeah. So it's a good vibe you got going. That's your own, right? So that's the other thing, right? You just get your own thing, and then people like you just for your character, despite whatever the content's about. They just like the character.
Cool. Jack, are you concerned about cancel culture? Kind of going back to Joe Rogan, someone made the comment that he was too big to cancel. Which I don't know that I necessarily agree with. Do you worry about that? Kind of culture that's happening now.
Yeah, I worry about it. When you have, I mean, I don't want to get too far into it, but like sometimes there's just little things that happen that get a person fired, and it's not like they did anything. I was listening to Sam Harris podcast, right? And this guy wrote a book, and like 4 years before working at Apple, and he was comparing his girlfriend to the people who worked in Silicon Valley, to the other women in Silicon Valley. And he was showing that his girlfriend is better than the other women. And it's just that kind of language alone. When he got a job at Apple, like 4 years after the book came out, some people at Apple thought, oh, he doesn't like the women of Silicon Valley. And so he didn't do anything, physical or hurt, like he perpetuated some things perhaps, but he didn't actually do anything. He just compared it to some other people. And that got him fired from Apple. And it's surprising to me that just a few words can do that, and at the same time, Dr. Dre is on the payroll at Apple, who is very negative towards women and has actually some allegations against him, and yet he's still just fine getting paid at Apple.
Well, his history, I mean, he assaulted a woman early on.
Yeah.
And certainly the lyrics to his music are very misogynistic. And it's funny you mentioned that, because I've been a huge Dre fan for a long time, since the early days of NWA. And it was like, cancel culture isn't going after him. Why not? He's not, like you said, he's on Apple's payroll. And it's interesting how choosy it can be, and kind of how picky they can be, and pick on certain words, which I think for us podcasters, right, we say a lot of words in any given week, right?
Yeah, so I get worried that when you have a very loud minority, and it's not like the majority of people at Apple were upset,
right.
but then you got the what Apple wants to be seen as. Like they want to be seen as this certain culture and certain kind of political stance and stuff like that. And they're more concerned with that than they are with people. I don't know. Like it gets really muddy and confusing, and I don't know what to do. Right? When I have some of my favorite comedians or musicians doing things, it's really hard to undo that love for them.
Yeah.
So hard, because it's like, but this was what I grew up loving, and now what do I do? Like there's so many great memories. So it's it's very difficult for anyone to watch what's going on and see it when it's close to home, right? When it hits the person who you love that person, right? And now it's that person. It's like
I feel that way with Russell Simmons, right? Being a huge fan of hip hop, and I think the allegations against him are deplorable. But again, it goes back to your point. Like before all that stuff come out, I was like, wow, Russell Simmons is a role model, like huge in hip hop, successful business person, and then all that stuff comes out about him, and it hurts, right?
Yeah. So I don't know what's going to happen with all that.
Jack, what's your, I guess, two-part question? Like, first, what's your favorite episode if you had to pick one, which I know is hard, but also if folks haven't listened to your show, like, do you recommend that they tune into certain episodes that really embody the spirit of Darknet Diaries?
Yeah, I think the favorite for everyone, including me, is Xbox Underground. This is the one where a group of video game players decided to hack into Xbox and video game companies, and the story there is just crazy. It's crazier than I could ever write it, even if it was a fictional story. And it's my favorite because I got like 3 or 4 people involved with it to interview, and just listening to them tell it is just bonkers. But it is a two-parter. So yeah, the Xbox Underground is the name of that one. And it's my favorite because that was the first time that somebody brought me a story. And it was, Sanad is the guy in that story. He just getting out of prison, and he messaged me saying, I don't know who you are, but I was told to tell you my story. And I was like, okay, well, I don't know who you are, so prove that you have like a real story. And he sends me like indictments and stuff. And I was like, oh my gosh. This is huge. And it wasn't a new story. Wired already reported on it. And this is what's really fascinating about my show is Wired reported on it long before I did an episode on it. And then when I do an episode, a lot of people listen to it. And then, Wired recycles some of their content sometimes on Twitter and says, oh, don't forget about this story about the Xbox hackers.
Yeah, that's important.
And every time they post that on Twitter, somebody always says, oh, you should check out the Darknet Diaries podcast. And I'm like, no, guys, they posted a story first.
Yeah, but that's a good symbiotic relationship right there. That's good. Yeah. Because hopefully people check out both works, right? Because I would go read the war and listen to the podcast. You would do both. Yeah,
definitely.
Do you have a favorite cybersecurity books? We've been talking a lot about books. I've kind of gone back myself into a lot of older books and I listen on Audible to my books. And I found that to your point with Darknet Diaries telling stories, there's a lot of great stories from history told in these books. Do you have some of your favorite books?
Yeah, I do. So I really liked Countdown to Zero Day with Kim Zetter.
Yeah, one of my favorites too.
Sandworm by Andy Greenberg. American Kingpin, the story of Ross Ulbricht by Nick Belton. Those are great. One that I think you might not have heard of is The Burglar's Guide to the City. It's a bunch of stories of people who broke into buildings, like actual criminals. And it's fascinating to see how they did it. I also liked Playing to the Edge by Michael Hayden. He was the
NSA director.
Who was he, Jeff?
See the NSA.
He was the Dernzo. Yeah,
he was a director of the NSA at one time.
Yep.
Yeah, and so he wrote a book on some of the reasons why the NSA does what they do, and it's fascinating to see the other side of it, right? So, he's like, we got all the approvals from all the different courts and all the things before we make any choices. Yeah. And I don't know how much of that is just smoke in my face, but it's interesting.
Oh, let me tell you.
He was the director during Stuxnet, I believe.
Yeah, I think so.
Yeah, so that one gave me a really good perspective.
Awesome.
I really like the book Bitcoin Billionaires.
Oh,
that was written by the same guy who wrote The Social Network.
Yeah, okay.
But didn't make a movie on Bitcoin Billionaires yet.
Yeah, I was watching a documentary on cryptocurrency that was pretty good. Do you like any of that? Do you go back and watch the documentaries? I think you and I are pretty similar in like researching our industry. And I've watched like every documentary on hackers. Like on Amazon, I just search for hackers. I watched every single one.
Yeah, some of them are a joke, but
some of them are really bad. Yes, agreed.
Yeah. Would you ever consider, maybe you have already, I don't know your entire inventory. Would you ever consider talking to Cliff Stahl? I mean, because his story was turned into a Nova episode where he played himself, but I almost want to hear a Darknet Diaries version of
There's
Cliff
a lot
Stahl's
to that story. The Cyberpunk's book that we talked about goes deeper into that story than even the Cuckoo's Egg.
Somebody was telling me, and I'm not going to remember any of the details, but at some point over the last couple of years when we were talking about Cliff Stahl came up on the show, somebody reached out to me and told me that there's a documentary that was made about the East German hackers.
Yeah. And they're featured in the book,
It's from their perspective. Yeah. And it's like a whole different view of the story.
Cyberpunks goes into that story behind not just the one hacker that was directly the person hacking into Clifford Stahl's systems. He was part of a group. And one of the guys in that group, they said committed suicide by setting himself on fire. Are you familiar with that story, Jack? That's pretty interesting.
Yeah, that's a crazy story. So there's a bunch of stories that are connected, right? So Cliff Stahl wrote The Cuckoo's Egg, which is some hackers got into the college's network, and he was trying to figure it out. And then he kind of ends the book figuring out who it was, but the story goes on to like who those it doesn't talk about the other side of who those guys were. And there's this movie called 23, which if you're gonna look up this movie, don't get the one with Jim Carrey. Get the one that's the German.
The
version.
German. I've heard of this movie before.
That's the one
Jack.
that somebody was telling me about.
I haven't watched it yet.
Yep.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I've watched it, and it goes into it's the other side of the story. So it's the hackers who were hired to do this,
yes,
and how they did it, and all this kind of stuff. And so
they were hired by the Russians to commit espionage. Well, to basically break into the U.S. to steal secrets. Like they never got anything good. In the book that I read, that they basically they never really got anything good.
Yeah, and that's where it comes out that somebody died. That was part of that.
Yeah. That is a crazy story.
Yeah, I do want to do that one, but I feel like a movie's made on it, a book is made on it. When stuff is already at that level, I kind of feel like it might have been overdone.
Yeah, like the story's already been told, right? Like I like your show because you tell the stories that haven't necessarily been told yet.
Yeah, new books that come out, I like to kind of highlight them and just tell other people about it.
Well, it's a wish list item for me, nonetheless.
Okay.
If you can find, an element of the story that hasn't been told yet,
that would be cool.
That would be cool.
The other one that I people want me to do is the Kakata 3301 story, and I'm waiting on that for somebody who was part of it or somehow involved to interview for it, and I'm not going to do it until I get someone from there.
You got any teasers for us, Jack, about what might be coming up?
Not that we're not going to listen anyway.
Right. True.
All your episodes.
Yeah, I got some. People like the pen testing stories, so I've got more of those coming out. And for some reason, it's a whole bunch of old anonymous hackers have just been reaching out to me like crazy. And so a lot of different, fill in the blank sec, right? So not lulsec, not whatever sec, but the third rate and fourth rate secs. All these little groups have been reaching out. So I'm doing my best to kind of figure out who in the heck they are and what were they involved with, and getting those ones. So there'll be a few of those that come out, and then I'm going to do a bunch of stuff on spamming botnets and Zeus and Mirai at some point.
If I could make a request, because this was based on a book that I'd read about Max Butler, aka Max Vision. When or if he's released from prison, I haven't checked lately to see what his status is. I think that would be an amazing interview. I don't know if you're familiar with the story or read the book. Yeah,
I have. The update is he's out, but he's in a halfway house, and he's still recuperating into society. So.
Oh, okay. Well, that's good to know that he's out. I mean, after reading the book, I definitely had a lot of empathy for his story.
Yeah, I think he was the second longest prison sentence ever for cybersecurity crime.
Yeah. Yep. That's cool. That's on my wish list for you.
Do you have any guests on your list that you think there's no way in hell you can pull them off?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. What's your how would we phrase that?
Your bucket list.
Your bucket list of interviews.
Yeah. There's the 0-day brokers, right? So we're talking. There's some known ones out there, right? So Charlie, what's his name? Charlie
Miller. Yep.
As Twitter says, I'm that 0-day guy. So he likes to be known as the 0-day guy. But every time I ask him, hey, can I talk to you about 0 days? He's like, oh, no. We're not talking about that.
Yeah.
So Charlie Miller, I've asked like pretty much every year, you ready to talk yet?
He'll talk about car. I mean, we had him talking about car hacking and stuff like that. But that's interesting. You've pressed him on the 0-day topic, and he won't do it.
Yeah, and there's some other people like that, which I'm not going to name because they don't like being associated with that kind of thing. But that's the angle, right? They created 0 days and sold it to governments or whoever's the highest payer.
Yeah,
and so it's this gray market.
Yeah, that is super interesting.
So it's come up on Discord. I was thinking the same thing. Do you interview the actual bad guy hackers that were actually doing it for all the wrong reasons and got caught?
Yeah, most of the time I'll interview them after they've done their prison time.
Mm-hmm.
So it's rare for someone to come to me and say, I have all these crimes I've done and I've not been caught for it.
Yeah.
And I'll be able to tell you. But that's starting to come around. That's what's strange. That's starting to come to me.
Yeah, that would be interesting. I mean, that's been requested of us over the years. Jack is like, oh, can you interview someone that like is actually doing these crimes? And I'm like, well, why would they talk to us if they're committing a crime? They haven't been convicted of it, right? But that would be awesome if you could pull that off.
Yeah, I mean, I've had a few already tell me, but it's one of those, how do I prove that you're telling the truth, right? So, like, there was that, I can't remember what it was. There was a big denial of service attack on that DNS provider.
Dine. That was
Dine. Yeah,
Dine.
Yeah, the people who did that reached out to me and told all, but I was like, how do I prove this? Like, how do I fact check this? I've heard your story and your friend's story, and I've seen your Discord, and how do I know it was actually that, right? So it's just really hard to get to that.
Yeah.
Of course, I was wondering about how do you do the fact checking when you're talking to ex-NSA people?
Yeah, that's also difficult, right?
The more ex-NSA people I talk to, the more I can compare, right?
Well, yeah, they corroborate each other's stories.
If you ever have questions, let me know.
See what I mean? There you go.
I can maybe confirm nor deny. But NSA is an interesting beast.
I was told that when you start working at NSA, you're given the book, Cliff Stoll's book, The Cuckoo Egg, to say, hey, get familiar with this, and you'll get a better understanding of what's going on. Have you ever heard that, Jeff?
I have not heard that, but it's coming up on 25 years since I left NSA, so that certainly could be the case now.
Yeah, it's kind of the dated book though, so I'm wondering. I've heard some people say that my show gets kicked around at the NSA as like, this is what you need to know before like, understanding our group or something. So I've kind of replaced that in some way.
Well,
that's kind of cool.
I take issue with that though, because I don't care how old the stories are, the techniques, the motivations, the mindset behind it. Maybe the technology is old,
today.
but
I agree, holds true today.
The frame of mind, it's timeless.
The human nature hasn't changed, Jeff?
Correct.
You think even when we go to IPv6, it's going to be the same?
That changes everything, Jack. You know that.
It's just like Linux on the desktop. It's coming. Jack, we just have 5 questions left for you. Are you ready to play 5 questions with Security Weekly?
Yeah, let's do it.
3 words to describe yourself.
Teacher, goofy, and curious.
If you were a serial killer, what would be your weapon of choice?
Oh my gosh, I've heard you ask these questions a million times and I never sorted it out.
It's amazing how people are unprepared for these questions after 16 years.
I think some sort of time travel. Like if I could do all the work and then transport myself to another part of the world and then say, haha, wasn't me.
Or another universe like Loki, right?
Yeah.
If you wrote a book about yourself, what would the title be?
Oh man, I don't know about that.
That's a good title, actually. I don't know about
that. The more you give, the more you get.
What is your favorite hacker movie?
Does Mr. Robot count?
That's a TV show.
It's a TV show.
Close. Do you have a movie?
I guess Sneakers.
Sneakers? There you go.
Who am I siding with on this?
You're siding with me.
You're siding with Jeff on that one, yeah. I'm in the hackers camp. But
Johnny,
Jeff,
are we keeping a tally?
We should be keeping a tally. Jack, choose 2 celebrities to be your parents.
Alive, dead, fictional, or otherwise?
I guess I'd want like somebody really smart and really caring. So Einstein and who was the lady in Lord of the Rings that gave Frodo the sword? She always has like this motherly, caring aspect. She was Mick Jagger's daughter.
Bianca.
Yeah, we know who you're
Or was
talking
that
about.
his wife?
We can't. We're too lazy to Google it at this point. So.
Yeah, so she has this really motherly, caring feel to her. She was an elf in the show, and she knew Frodo had to do this thing, so she didn't want to stop him, but she gave him some help to get there, right? So she gave him a sword, and I was like, man, I wish that was my mom.
Awesome. Jack, thank you so much for appearing on Paul Security Weekly.
Yes, this was great. I'm so glad to be here.
So nice to have you. For our listeners, make sure you check out Darknet Diaries, fantastic podcast. Coming up next is the security news. Stay tuned. Keeping up with security issues across thousands of web assets without the right approach to web application security is a daunting task. Get ahead with web vulnerability scanning automation from NetSparker, a leader in dynamic and interactive application security testing, known for its ease of use and accurate results. Detect a wide range of vulnerabilities in all legacy and modern web applications, address security bugs at scale by automating the confirmation process, automatically prioritize vulnerabilities, and assign actionable tickets to the right developers in their native workflows for rapid remediation. For more information on how to scale application security with ease, visit securityweekly.com/NetSparker. Qualys has brought together vulnerability management and patch management, letting security teams discover vulnerabilities and apply patches immediately, all within a single, unified app. Sign up for a free trial of Qualys VMDR, vulnerability management, detection, and response today at securityweekly.com/Qualys. Security Weekly is more than happy to announce that we'll be at InfoSec World 2021 in person on October 25th through the 27th, 2021. Our annual partnership with InfoSec World is extra special because we're all on the same team. We're all part of the Cyber Risk Alliance. That means Security Weekly listeners and InfoSec World attendees get to see and hear from many of the Security Weekly team. And at the event, you will save 20% off your World Pass. Visit securityweekly.com/ISW 2021 and register using our discount code. Also, hey, if you want to stay in the loop, all things Security Weekly, you can visit securityweekly.com/subscribe. You can subscribe to all of the shows on the Security Weekly network via your favorite podcast catcher or our YouTube channel. Sign up for our mailing list, join the Discord server, and follow us on our live streaming platforms such as Twitch. And now we're going to talk about the security news. Yes, that's right.
We are.
What do we got? What was big? What was the big story this week? We want to start with the big story.
Yeah, get it out of the way.
What was the big story this week?
Probably Kaseya. I don't know how you say it. Kaseya.
Kaseya?
Yeah, it's Kaseya. They were actually a sponsor on the Security Weekly network for a while. Yeah, they had a 5 or 6 vulnerabilities that were disclosed, and I think the story is they were disclosed and fixed, and then people didn't apply the patches quick enough, and then ransomware ensued. Right? One of the is that true, Lee? No, they get the timeline
very
wrong.
Close. So they had fixed all but one, the last of which was scheduled for a June patch rollout, and it was that last one that was the 0 day.
Was that the remote code? Was that the RCE?
Yep.
Yeah.
I mean, I could find the CVE of it, but basically they got all these 6. They prioritized one wrong and they got nailed. I mean, what do you do? And because other than that, they were working with the folks that disclosed them. They were verifying that they were fixed. As they fixed each one of them, they were being on the vulnerability disclosure front. They were nailing it, except for the priority. I mean, what do you do?
Yeah.
But if they'd prioritized the one, maybe the other one that they downgraded would have been the one. So maybe they were screwed either way.
I had the list of them. There was like a cross-site scripting, a SQL injection.
Yeah.
And some other ones. But obviously the most impactful was the remote code execution.
Yeah.
Which then, I mean, there's like a zillion articles on this story.
Yeah.
That cropped up out there.
Which almost makes me not want to talk about it. But
yeah, I know. Like I feel the same way. Like when I go through stories, I'm like, I can see a trend here. Like everyone's talking about this. Like maybe we should talk about something different, perhaps.
Perhaps.
Well, there was a cool bit though to this, and that when they shut down to complete that patch and deploy it, they also re-architected their network. And then they rolled all that up into customer recommendations, and they went live before they gave the patch out to customers to make sure it all kind of worked. So that's like we're eating our own dog food before we hand it out. That's pretty darn honorable. I mean, yeah, I'm with you. I don't want to play the heck out of that story, but they did do some nice things. I'd like to see more of that.
Well, yeah, let's let that be the emphasis. They kind of were doing the responsible thing. They did what they could. We can't knock them
that way.
for what they were doing. in systematically approaching multiple problems. And they still got bit, but that's the reality of security.
Yeah, they weren't just sitting back going, like we're not going to patch those things, right? They were.
No,
that's not us. That's not real. That doesn't exist. Go away.
They were super. It seemed to me they were super motivated to get all this stuff fixed and get fixes out to their customers. So yeah.
Enough of that.
And I mean, it happens. I think some of the articles, Lee, I think is in your article, right? Like. Some of the recommendations, that might have been one of my articles on ransomware, right? Like one of them was like, don't get malware, right? But the other thing was, like isolate your stuff and minimize the impact. I mean, back to our first segment with Scott. I mean, we talked, Scott, and I agree with his approach, likes to talk about being proactive and having that maintenance too, but also I think minimizing the impact is important. In short of, I mean, we can patch all day long and still not get everything in terms of a patch. Like we're not going to be able to patch everything, and there's going to be 0 days, and there's kind of like that middle ground right after prevention, so to speak, that like you just kind of minimize the impact, right? That configuration in your architecture should help to minimize the impact as well. So I think there's some onus on the vendors to do everything they can, but even if they do, there's the onus is also on you to minimize that impact. We talked about that with SolarWinds. We talked about isolation, hardening, the buzzword of zero trust. But how does that apply? That means a good architecture and good teamwork, I think, are the two main ingredients to having a good security architecture.
Well, I'm glad you brought the first segment up again, because I was thinking about it then and decided not to get into it. But to me, the essence of security is not locking down everything, hardening everything, being up to date on patches, and doing all the stuff that you necessarily need to do. Security to me begins after you've done all that. How do you focus on detection and response, minimizing the impact?
Yep.
Because the reality is something's going to get you. We could argue whether that philosophy works with ransomware, because once it's happened, it's happened. But to me, the essence of security, and I've talked about this. There was a conference talk I gave a couple years ago in the pre-times that talked about, there's so many things that we focus on in our industry and we spend all of our time on, to me, is just the table stakes. It's like that's just the job of IT, patching, finding vulnerabilities, writing secure code. That should just be stuff that's done. Then security kicks in, and it's the monitoring, it's the detection, it's the response, it's figuring out that something is going wrong and doing something about it. Given that, I think the trend is apparent. Despite everybody's best efforts, you're never going to be completely there in terms of a secure network, impermeable, and yet that seems to be what most of the industry focuses on. You got to buy one more thing, you got to get this, how did you live without that, you got to have it. Even the idea of you need to do something with firmware, I agree with that, but to me the problem is, how do you motivate companies to actually do something about that and make it ingrained in their business model, how they're doing business. And again, I would dare say updating firmware is not a security issue. It's something you should be doing as part of your IT operations.
Yeah. IT hygiene, right? I mean, going back to Darknet Diaries too, episode 96, which we didn't talk about with Jack, is his latest interview that he has, or episode he has posted up there. It's called The Police Station Incident. I won't spoil that because it is the most recent one.
Thanks.
But when you get the lesson from that, it really comes down to like just really good hygiene. And the last 60 seconds or so when they're describing like after everything happened, what they did to fix all the issues, I'm like, that's the real lesson. Like if you listen to any part of that interview, you listen to the last 60 seconds and it's like, when we fixed the process, we fixed the procedures, we fixed how we operated, the operational aspects of it. If they had done that first, they wouldn't have been victims of.
Well, there's that nasty word again, process.
Yeah.
It's all, we talk about people, process, and technology, and I'm broadly being generic here. I've heard countless talks where people talk about, well, people are the weakest link. We've heard that for years.
Yeah.
People. And yet we focus on the technology because that's something tangible and we can buy something and say it's there and we can do something. But we really don't have a good handle on the process yet. And yet, to me, that's the biggest problem.
It's the least sexy.
It's the least sexy.
Because you can't go buy a product to fix your process.
Right.
You can buy a product that helps your process, that supports your process. But you can't go buy a product that's going to define and implement your process.
Right.
Is that true?
But you can automate it.
You can automate it, but you got to define it first.
Right. Well, and that's what. Well, it's funny you bring that up because this is not about me, but I give another talk where I talk about people, process, and technology. But the part that to me is overarching to all that, what you're touching on, is purpose. Why are you doing any of these things? What is it that you have of value that you're trying to protect? And how much do you care about losing that? And in the old days where I come from, it was all about the data. We've only introduced more issues with all the advances in technology where it's not simply about the data anymore. There's other aspects and elements, and you could argue that it's still data, but
it's all about the information, Marty.
It's all about the information. Exactly.
I mean, it still is, but it's also about the operations that store, transmit, and protect that information. And that's what I think is the interesting thing about the latest trend in the culmination of the attack in ransomware is it's preventing you from getting access to your data, right? So, I mean, it is about the data, but it's also about how you're handling your data, transmitting, processing, accessing your data. It's attacking more of the operational aspects of it than the data. Because like when we talk about PCI and data breaches, it was, I want to get access to your data. Because your data, when you talk about payment card information, is credit card numbers. And those are valuable. And I'm just going to steal it, right?
Right.
Now we flipped that. We've talked about this, right? We flipped it and go, I'm just going to lock you out of your data,
right?
And that's
well, and to put it in the terms of the data security triad, which is what I grew up on: confidentiality, integrity, availability.
They're attacking the availability.
I'm making up the numbers, but I would say 95% of our industry is focused on the confidentiality. Yeah, and second is integrity, availability. I mean, if ransomware, and I know we have a story where we're talking about the White House has formed a ransomware task force or whatever.
Yep.
We haven't really tackled availability very well, at least in the private sector. I'm not saying that we did it well back in the DoD days.
Well, we all knew you had to have backups.
Yeah. That takes care of it.
Just an ode to another podcast with Jeff Moss, Malicious Life. Jeff tells a great story about backups. And he was like, dude, it was like back in the day, and I saved up for this hard drive, and I was backing it up, and then it died. And the restore process, if you remember tape backups, was like rolling the dice at a craps table, right?
Oh, yeah.
Like I'm talking like 20 plus years ago, restoring from old tapes was, you roll that dice and it's about the same odds that you're going to get your data back. And he's like, yeah, I didn't roll a good hand, basically, was the story that Jeff tells, right? Which is kind of actually kind of funny considering his first conference was in Las Vegas, but
that is funny.
And there was reasons for that too. Yeah. That's some interesting things about DEF CON, right? In that interview on Malicious Life. So it was a pretty good one. I liked it.
Yep. You're reminding me of it was about a year ago. I was rebuilding a system. I'd made a backup. I'd put it on a disk that I had encrypted. And then I forgot the password. So after rebuilding the system by other means, I got almost completely done. And I found where I stored the password for the backup disk. That's a level-setting moment, don't you think?
You wrote it down on a sticky note.
Isn't like RAID a backup? So I'll tell you a story that happened today. We had a server. It was actually given to us, right? It was kind of like one of those old decommissioned servers, which is why I brought it up a couple times on the show tonight, because it just happened like yesterday and today. Old server. It was configured in a RAID array. We went to install Linux on it, and it just kept failing and kept failing and kept failing. And last night at dinner, I was talking with Doug, and he was like, check the array. He's like, if that server kind of got thrown around, you moved it, and it's really old, he's like, some of those drives could have failed. And I'm thinking, like, but it has RAID. But it turned out there was 8 drives in it, and the best I could tell, 2 of the drives had failed. So I had to pull 2 of the drives, which, and I was again explaining to the intern, like, there's only so much redundancy in the array that can store like the extra data that's corrupt on the other drives. And like essentially we ran out of space. Right. Now I had already backed up thankfully I had already backed up the server, decommissioned. I didn't need anything on any of these drives. But if you did, you'd be screwed, because now I had to pull 2 of the drives, and it was like, you got to rebuild the entire array. So I had to like rebuild everything from scratch. I got 6 working drives. 8 I had to pull, and all data is gone. So a backup is only as good as your ability to restore it.
Yep.
Oh, but on the government, it was the White House announces a ransomware task force.
Yep.
I don't want to poo-poo the efforts to combat ransomware, which I think really as we've talked on the show, is about combating good computer security, hygiene and architecture, a good defense, understanding the adversary and protecting our assets, right? And I guess my kind of gripe is, the White House seems to be, and I don't want to fault them too much because they are paying attention to cybersecurity, which I think is really important and really good. But they seem to be really, like, when you read the executive orders and some of the appointments and the things that the people who are appointed in these positions for cybersecurity for the U.S. government are saying, they're really heavy on the messaging of information sharing. I don't think that's a bad thing, but I'm like, what are we doing to put focus on the prevention of ransomware and the disruption of ransomware actors? Information sharing is a part of that, but I feel like it's the focus, and it's getting too much of the focus, because information sharing only gets you so far. Like, that's basically, in my assessment, like telling everyone, yeah, like, here we're breached and here's how it happened. Like, that's great. Like, but what are we doing to prevent those? And what are we doing to, like, take the fight to the threat actors that are enacting this ransomware in our systems?
Yeah, that was my immediate impression when I first read the EO when it came out, however many months ago. It's like, wow, they're talking all about information sharing.
A lot of it was about that.
And on Security and Compliance Weekly, I forget what episode it is, Johnny will tell me in a few moments in my ear, but we interviewed a buddy of mine that used to work in the pit, and he went out into the commercial sector, and he did a lot with, he basically helped start the ISACs.
Yeah.
And he spent a lot of years in financial services, so he was in basically
important aspect. The ISACs are amazing.
It's important.
It is,
but yeah, there's something about it that's like you're missing the point. That's already too little, too late. I mean, I understand it. I guess theoretically, in terms of if you share what's going wrong, you help other people go fix problems.
And that's the thing. I mean, but it's very similar to Ring. I don't know if you have a Ring doorbell, which is one of our other stories, but like it tells you, like, after another incident has happened. So I'll get a Ring alert that goes, the scariest one I got, someone captured on their Ring someone in like a ski mask with a rifle walking on their property.
Wow.
That's scary. Like, good that I know about this particular threat actor, but it was after that had happened. Right. So, like, it doesn't speak to the, if I don't, even if I know or don't know that's going to happen is irrelevant. Like, have I considered that threat? Have I done the threat modeling to say, well, like, what if that happens? Right. How am I going to call the police? How am I going to make sure my cameras are working? How am I going to make sure I'm protecting my home? I have to do that stuff before that threat actor in a ski mask shows up on my front lawn. I mean, great that there's information sharing that, like, almost instantly I get that alert that happened. Right. That's good, but it's just one piece to the puzzle.
But if we're trying to prevent ransomware from being effective, I think we're back to talking about all those non-sexy things.
Yes.
That you just, the good hygiene.
Right. The inglorious purpose.
And all the stuff that you should be doing anyway, but for whatever reason you don't. Mm-hmm. And part of it, I think I was thinking about this during the first segment, was we've sort of conditioned all of our professionals in the industry in IT and security to just put out the fires. We're constantly putting out the fires. What's the loud screaming problem that's happening? We don't ever have the time to go back and do all the good hygiene. Some organizations do, but the majority of understaffed, underfunded, overworked organizations, all they have time for is whatever's the next big thing that's the next dumpster fire that's burning. So how as an industry do we help retrain and shift the conversation towards the all that stuff that we don't like to talk about and nobody will get
to do? But I think a lot of that speaks to technical debt, Jeff. Right?
Yeah.
Like I even think of it when we're implementing physical systems here, and even a lot of times we throw stuff together and run cables and all that stuff, and it's kind of messy. And I'm like, that's physically part of our technical debt, because at some point we got to go clean some of that stuff up. I mean, it's the same thing whether you're deploying to the cloud, rushing out an application, you're incurring that technical debt. When something's working and you leave it alone and you don't touch it for years, you've got a lot of technical debt to clean up. And I think that for me, that's one of the pivotal things when we talk about the insecurity in our organizations. That's just very striking to me, is that it usually comes down to technical debt biting us in several different ways. Security risk, operational risk, a lot of it's technical debt.
Yep, that's true.
One of the interesting things I saw today that I didn't put in the news segment was that CISA released a site called stopransomware.gov, which talks about, it defines ransomware, what to do if you've been hit, and how to prevent it. It looks like it's still growing. It's fairly light, except on the what is column.
Is that the tool they released too? That's like a survey, like a question.
That's a different one. They released that survey separately, which is like a ransomware preparedness assessment tool.
Yes.
Try and say that fast.
Right. And it's written it's written for like Windows 95 or something like that. We covered on ESW. I don't know why they did that. It could have been a website, but they released it as
because like you said earlier, they're repurposing stuff that still works and still. I mean, there's not new solutions to these problems. Yeah. The solutions have been known all the way back to the Orange Book.
Which was in Hackers, by the way.
And really, in their prevention, they
I think it was the Red Book.
They've got good security practice habits like we were talking about. You may not agree with the list, but they're starting with the basics, which is good.
Well, it's starting with the basics, but it's also who's on the hook for doing it. And there's too much...
You mean accountability?
Well, not even accountability, but just responsibility. I mean, there's a perception in organizations that security is done by somebody else. I don't have to do it.
Put in the security context, what's the difference between accountability and responsibility?
Whether you get fired or not?
Yeah. Blame?
Yeah.
Where's the buck stop?
It's my responsibility to patch these systems, but if I don't, I'm accountable for them, and I could get fired. That's it. I never thought about the nuances in that, the language behind that, right?
Yeah.
I mean, I think there is a difference in theory, maybe the one or the other, and we could probably muse over it for a longer than we need to.
Yeah, like we're getting very philosophical.
When is it management's responsibility versus the practitioner's responsibility? Because the practitioners mostly are going to just do what they're told to do. And of course, the organizations that I've been to over the years that were, in my opinion, the most secure were the ones where there were people that were going above and beyond because they knew that they needed to do it. Whether it was their responsibility or not.
They didn't want to be held accountable, therefore they took responsibility for it.
Yes.
Yeah.
Enough of that. We're getting we're getting way too deep into the Balvenie.
Lee, I want to talk about I made a joke about Linux on the desktop. Largely because I'm a Linux user. I run Linux on all my desktops for a lot of reasons. I think control, which also has an element of responsibility to it as well, and there's a lot of other reasons as well. But Microsoft came up with this new release, and this is where I predicted, and I have to admit, I heard this on another podcast, and I think it was on the Twit network, they were talking about the future direction of Microsoft. And I mean, they were really of the opinion that Windows 11 wouldn't happen, that Microsoft was all in on what now I'm learning is called Windows 365 Cloud, that the operating system would be kind of irrelevant, abstracted away, that the Microsoft experience would be exactly what is described in my article number 1, the Windows 365 Cloud, that you could run all of Microsoft's applications in suite on whatever operating system you wanted, that it would be hosted in the cloud, it would be a cloud-first experience with your Microsoft products, and it'll run on Linux. It'll run on an iPad. It doesn't matter what operating system or hardware that you have.
Or firmware?
Or firmware, right? You could have this Microsoft experience. ZDNet ran an article and was like, Microsoft just blew up the only reason you can't use a Linux desktop.
Right.
And I was like, this is the year of the Linux desktop. Or maybe next year still. But I think this is kind of exciting. I like this direction for Microsoft.
I can remember, and I think I was still in the office that got reorganized into the pit. So we're talking early 90s. We got it wasn't Linux, it was Apple, but it would emulate the Windows desktop. Yeah. And we thought that was cool.
Yeah.
And most Linux,
I've been there.
Most Linux interfaces look a lot like Windows these days.
No, and I've been there, but this is exciting because it gives you that experience independent of it's not emulation. I'm running this software.
Right.
And the cloud is my
But the problem back then was all the apps and software that was written for Windows wouldn't necessarily run
in the emulation. Emulation is a bad way to solve the problem, in my opinion.
This looks like to me like they're doing, Windows desktops hosted in Azure, and they're going to run all the Microsoft apps, and they're working on getting more of the apps. That there's compatibility tells me it's not quite a full Windows or something's different about it.
Sure.
But with and all you have is a display. You're a terminal.
Yeah. You're back to the mainframe model, right? Yeah.
And I was thinking, well, what about when you're disconnected? But for most of us, life stops when we're disconnected. So maybe that's not a showstopper anymore.
Yeah. I agree, Lee. I think from security, this could be a very positive thing as well. It puts the configuration and security back on the cloud, where it is largely today and should be, right? And abstracts that and what I love about it too, as we've talked on the show for years, we get into trouble in security with legacy applications. Now, if applications are being developed in this Windows 365 cloud, it's not tied to the operating system at all. And my hope is that when you're using a system like this, you can update the operating system and not have it impact your applications. That's a huge win. Well,
imagine being able to deliver the solution to everybody in the company, and if Paul needs 4 times as much CPU and memory as Jeff does, you've still got the same environment. You just change the settings on the virtually, and they make this machine the right size.
Right. Is that dissimilar from VDI? I still feel like VDI is not the right solution for this. This sounds like a hybrid between running apps locally and VDI, right? Like this sounds like somewhere in between.
It smells a lot like Amazon Workspaces, which I've used.
Yep.
But I suspect Microsoft's going to try and leapfrog Amazon in their offering. They're talking about multi-factor support. They talked about zero trust, and they were executive order compliant with all the buzzwords, which was kind of neat. But and I don't fault them for that. I mean, you got to look at where the buzz is and deliver on it. I just want to get my hands on trying it.
Right. I think Microsoft wants to get out of the operating system game. I think they realize long term that's not a viable financial option for them. I think they're better off licensing cloud applications, like this article talks about. And I think security wise, it's a much better play. And I think it keeps you sticky to the Microsoft environment, but doesn't care about I think that's a really innovative thinking on Microsoft's part. Also on Microsoft bug bounties, any guess from July 1st, 2020 to June 30th, 2021, what Microsoft paid out in bug bounties? I put it in the notes so you could read it, but if you haven't read it...
I haven't read it. I'll guess 10 million.
Close. 13.6 million. Yeah, that's a really good guess, Jeff. I'll give that one to Jeff. Any idea how many security researchers that were paid out a bug bounty contributed to that 13.6 million?
I'll drop 10.
10 researchers?
No, 136,000 researchers.
136,000 researchers?
Yeah, because they don't pay.
That seems like too many.
Maybe 2 zeros.
No, that's too many.
13,000.
No, take another guess. How many researchers you think?
136. I'll go with that.
Okay. It was 341.
Okay.
So, like, if I do the math, provided my math is correct, and I suck at math, but so if you got 341 full-time employees at $150,000, that's $51 million that Microsoft has to pay out, right? Oh. So I was kind of like, what if Microsoft were to just hire all these bug bounty people and bring them in-house? And I used $150,000 as kind of like an average kind of salary, right? Because there's other costs other than the salary you pay. I like you to pay them benefits and get them computers and all that stuff. Right? FTEs cost more than the actual salary you pay.
It used to be the physical office space that you needed to actually put somebody at a desk.
That's not true, right?
That's gone.
That's gone. So
overhead. They call it overhead.
But I think for Microsoft, like economically, this still works out, right? Like if they have to pay $13.6 million to have a bug bounty program, and you got 341 people that contributed to it, that economically this worked out for Microsoft.
Well, what was the reporting period?
1 year.
1 year. Yeah. So I mean, it makes sense too because they may not have to pay that out. Whereas if they hired them as a full-time
and they have to,
basis,
it's a fixed cost.
They may or may it's a fixed cost, and they may or may not. It's like that's why contracting became so popular.
Because it's I agree. Because you can terminate a contractor after a certain period of time and put them on a short. So for Microsoft, this works out, right? That's not every company, but in this case, I think for large software companies, maintaining a bug bounty program is financially viable, and that may not translate to other smaller companies, but for Microsoft, I think it worked out when I looked at that. I was like, that's pretty good, right? Did Lee have to drop?
Okay. Oh, it's us then.
It's just me,
and I'm here, so I don't care how late we go.
That's just awesome. It's just we can just rant on and on.
We can go. Good night, Lee.
So I mean, I think you can pick on certain aspects of a bug bounty program, but I mean, just looking at this one kind of aspect of it, I thought it was pretty good for Microsoft, right? Like it helps I mean, they've got the budget. They could go hire a bunch more people, right? But they got the value from this program where I don't think they really have to change that.
And this is a program that was set up by Katie Moe, right?
It was originally. It's a good question. Does Microsoft still run this program themselves, or is this like a program? Like Microsoft's big enough, conceivably, they could have a program with HackerOne and BugCrown and have their own program.
Again, outsourcing.
Yeah, they could even outsource aspects of the program. To it as well.
Yep.
I think this is a big for bug bounties and for Microsoft. I think this is a win.
I guess I agree.
Encryption, since I have you
please
in studio with me, trapped in here in studio.
Yes.
Amazon rolls out encryption for Ring doorbells. What's interesting, Jeff, is I just rolled out a new Ring doorbell in my house. For a long story, Ring actually sent me a doorbell as a security person to kind of evaluate its value as a security device. They had sent me one, and I made some mistakes and kind of I lost the cable to my actual doorbell. So I have an AC adapter that's plugged into an outlet that provides power to my Ring doorbell.
Okay.
And it stopped working. And so my wife was like, I really like having that as a device in our home, so figure out what's wrong with it. And so the first thing I did was I tested the outlet. I'm like, does the outlet have power? Like, did I trip a breaker or GCFI outlet or whatever, right?
Right.
Outlet was fine. I'm like, all right, well, the next thing I'm going to test is the AC adapter. And I'm not the best with, Larry is way better at the hardware and, all that stuff. So, like, what I learned from Larry, I'm like, I've got a multimeter. I'm going to go test and make sure that I'm getting, voltage and amperage from the AC adapter. Mm-hmm. And I got nothing. Like, I tested it. I'm like, I'm getting nothing. All right, so maybe my AC adapter's dead.
Right.
But you can remove the Ring doorbell, and then the Ring doorbell has a USB port, micro USB adapter on it, so you can charge it. Mm-hmm. And so I plugged that in, and it didn't light up until tell me it was charging at all. So then I tried a different cable. I tried 2 different cables and 2 different power sources to charge my Ring doorbell. Nothing. So I came to the conclusion that not only is my AC adapter dead, my Ring doorbell is dead. Like, I need to order a new Ring doorbell and a new AC adapter, and I got that installed this morning, actually, before I left for work, and everything was fine. So I'm like, all right, well, maybe it was the lightning storms we had here in Rhode Island. Something got fried on my previous one, so I bought a new one.
Okay.
And then this article told me that, like, none of the footage from your Amazon Ring doorbell is encrypted. And I'm like, that's kind of creepy. Like, I'm getting creeped out by these devices in my house. Like, I've actually removed all of the Amazon Echo based devices from my home because I don't trust Amazon.
Right.
I've got some Google devices left, and like slowly I'm taking those out, and my family's kind of like on the fence. And I'm like, yeah, but privacy, it could record what we're doing, record what we're saying. I'm not comfortable with that. And so I've removed some of those devices, but the Ring doorbell is convenient. But then they came out with this feature in my story number 3. They're rolling out encryption.
Right.
And I'm totally all about this. Like, I should be the only one that should be able to view the footage from my Ring doorbell, and I should be the one to decide who I share that with.
Right.
And it sounds like that's what they've done. So they've rolled out end-to-end encryption. It uses public key infrastructure based on RSA 2048-bit asymmetric account signing key pair. Oh, right. So sexy.
It's sexy, but, and I haven't read the whole article. I read enough to know that they're using public key cryptography. So my first question is, okay, so the Ring doorbell, it's got the video camera. It's recording video.
And audio.
Two-way
audio, so I can talk to the people if I enable the microphone.
And is it an option that gets saved or stored?
No.
Or it's just streaming?
No, it does. I have to sign up for an account.
Okay.
And pay a fee to, I don't know, because I have Arlo and other services.
But the ordinary, I don't do all this stuff, so the ordinary lay person that's using this thing is using their smartphone.
You have an app. Yeah.
You have an app. You launch it, and
you can say whether or not, based on motion, you want it to record the video, or if you only want it to record when someone pushes.
But you're just launching it to see. Somebody rings the doorbell, so you bring it up and look at the video to see.
When someone rings the doorbell, you get a notification on your phone that someone's ringing the doorbell, and you push answer, and you can converse with that person and see them on your phone, and it records that.
So my question is, where's the public key? Where's the private key?
That's a good question. I haven't enabled this feature yet to kind of know how I set that up, right? I would assume that I would hold the private key, and anything that it records is encrypted with my private key.
Right.
And then I
or
can
it's embedded in the app.
Amazon's encrypting it with my public key, and only I can decrypt it with my private key. Right. Yeah.
That would make sense. And
thanks to Diffie, Hellman, and Merkle. Yep. We don't talk about Merkle so much. We talk about Diffie and Hellman, right? Merkle was involved to a certain extent, and then Revest, Shamir, and Edelman. Basically, what they came up with was the prime number, factoring prime numbers,
right,
and the certificate authorities to validate that the public key really is Amazon, right? Basically, like if I want to buy something on Amazon, they're saying this public key is from Amazon.
Right.
That's what. If I had to please correct me if I'm wrong, because when you talk about encryption like that at a higher level, there's a lot. There's a lot of math. There's a lot more to it than I'm describing, right? But Crypto by Steve Levy really gave me the kind of tools to help explain that to like people that don't know what crypto is. Like, what is RSA? What is encryption? But so that's how I think of it. But
to pivot on what Jack was saying, try to make it understandable. This is, high level mathematics. Yeah. I don't understand it. I'm not a mathematician. To put it in lay terms, you've got a key pair. There's public and private. You can encrypt anything you want. Anybody can have the public key, and all you can do is encrypt.
Right.
The only way that you decrypt it is you have the private key.
Right.
And the math, which I only understand at a marginal level,
there's a lot of
has to do with prime numbers and our next article that we should talk about is quantum computing.
Sure.
But the security of it is in the difficulty in factoring large prime numbers.
So I've multiplied two really large prime numbers.
Right.
The keys are like what those numbers are.
Yep.
Factoring is figuring out, without knowing what those numbers are, what numbers did I multiply together to get that number. Right. That's how I understood it at a high level.
But for me as a former cryptographer, the weakness of any crypto system typically is not the algorithm itself.
It's the implementation.
It's the implementation, and it's the endpoints.
Yep.
So I
have to keep my private key private.
Right.
But that was
which is why I'm wondering where it is.
Well, and that was Diffie and Hellman. That Crypto by Steve Levy goes into a great story about how Diffie was like, I just need to split the key in two. Like, that's essentially public key. Like, that was the really foundation of it. Was before that, if I had a key and I encrypted some data, I'd have to share that key with Jeff.
Right.
Diffie's kind of revelation, which was also a revelation had at GCHQ by other researchers that couldn't disclose it at the time. They came to the same conclusion that it'd be really neat if we just split the key.
Right.
And that was the foundation. The RSA algorithm built on that and added in, the best of my knowledge, not understanding the math, was like using prime numbers and factoring of prime numbers to in the key process.
Right. Yeah. So we don't need to go into the math, but we do need to go into where is the private key and how do you protect the private key?
Typically, that's with a passphrase. They don't term it as a password. It's a passphrase.
Well, and what you're saying, what's happening is the private key is itself encrypted. So the passphrase
is the encryption key to the. Is there another encryption algorithm? Typically, I feel like we should know this.
Typically, I'll put it in PCI terms. Not that that's going to help anybody, but the private key, which is the essence of what you want to get at, if you want to break you get the encrypted data and you want to break it, you want to decrypt it, you need the private key. So the private key itself needs to be protected, and that's typically done with another layer of protection. This goes back to NIST, and they have extensive documentation on all the different types of algorithms and strengths and key lengths and stuff like that. But you have the concept of the data encryption key, which in this case is the private key. It's what's being used to encrypt the video, but that key itself is protected with what's called a key encryption key.
Right.
And that's typically unlocked with a passphrase, which is not the key in and of itself, but it's a part of the key that accesses the key and makes it able to, I don't know the details, and I'm probably getting it wrong to some level. But to me, for this particular implementation where you're trying to protect the video because somebody could intercept it and it's not encrypted, or if it's being buffered or stored somewhere, if you decide to store it, hopefully it's going to be stored encrypted now. The way that you get at it.
Yeah, I would think you're right, because when you're capturing the video, like, is it is it unencrypted at a certain point and then encrypted with my public key? Like, at what point is it encrypted on the device, like as it's receiving video?
These are the types of questions you need to find out.
Like, is it in the camera? Like, is the camera
does the camera have the public key? Is it encrypting the video signal, which ultimately is just a string of bits?
As it's encoding it, it would have to do it as it's encoding it, right? Yeah, that's a good question.
But it's probably happening in the doorbell itself.
It could be, but again, we get back to IoT, like how much processing power do I have in my Ring doorbell to do encryption?
Or is it being sent to some processor that's in the cloud that's sort of transparent to you, the user,
right? And
that's where it's happening.
So if I'm in between the camera and the cloud, is it being transmitted unencrypted, just stored encrypted, but transmitted unencrypted? Probably my guess, given the computing resources and bandwidth, right?
Mm-hmm. So the beauty of encryption is it protects the data as it's being transmitted, and the theory is, well, it's an encrypted signal. You don't have the keys, but the way that most cryptography over the years has been attacked is not breaking the algorithm; it's finding the key.
Yes,
and stealing the key,
right. Or even portions of the key. Right, with a lot of attacks are you can derive portions of the key.
Yeah,
that gets into entropy and all.
We could get into the weeds on that, and we probably shouldn't. We would start to bore.
There's a lot of interesting segments I think we could do on.
But I mean, I tell a story about PGP, and of course, in the early days of PGP, Phil Zimmerman got in trouble because he was producing cryptography that wasn't regulated and wasn't controlled by the entity that was responsible in those days, which was NSA.
Yep.
And they went after him.
And his problem was with the cipher, right?
His problem was that he was producing what was classified as materiel. It was munitions.
Yes,
it was being exported, and so that's what they were going after him for.
The government had issues with what Zimmerman was doing,
right?
But also on the technical side of that, there was issues with his early ciphers. Which, what did he call that? He called a cipher the blender, something with the blender cipher or something like that. He based it on a Saturday Night Live skit we talked about a few weeks ago, right? There was an issue with his cipher. Yeah.
Right. But what the government went after him for and tried to prosecute him for was violating the export policy for munitions.
Correct.
But while I was at NSA, I know I've told this story on air before, so I'll go really quickly. We had a call to arms, stop the presses, everybody focus on coming up with an attack against PGP, because we had one of our customers that we were deeply invested in a multi-million-dollar encryption project. They came back to us and said, why do we need to spend millions of dollars on that when we can use PGP and it's pretty much free?
Right.
And isn't it just as good? So this call went out to find an attack against PGP, and there were some guys that came up with an attack against the PGP, but it was effectively
really attack against the software and the user, not the encryption algorithm, right?
Right. Yeah. I mean, they found a way to steal the secret key. They found a way to export the key ring, is what he called it. So, and it was actually a phishing attack.
Right, like a Word document or something.
It wasn't Word, but it was WordStar or whatever one of the precursors was, and they had some embedded code that they found some unused bit space. And so if you opened an attachment, this code would install and execute, find the key ring, and send it out. And the story that I tell is that they were lauded as heroes. They'd saved the day for NSA. We'd found a PGP attack, and but when I heard a lunch and learn briefing when they were talking to just us peons that worked with them, and it was in our lab, they told the story of what they had done. It was really cool. I mean they put this payload into very small space in the document, but essentially it was a phishing attack. And I asked them a question. I said, wouldn't this work against our system, anything. I mean, you're not attacking the crypto itself. You're not attacking the algorithm. You're stealing the key, and that's always kind of stuck with me, and it's borne out in so many cases where you can have the best crypto around, but if you're not protecting the keys. And by the way, and I don't know if everybody knows this, I don't know if this is common knowledge, but certificates, TLS SSL certificates, are essentially the public key. Right. It's a key.
Yeah.
We call it certificates, but it's a key.
It's the public key.
And it's basically...
The CA is just validating the public key is coming from Amazon.
Yep. And it's enabling
as an example,
our HTTPS, our secure web traffic. It's doing the initial handshake so that you can establish a data encryption key that can be used with a symmetric key algorithm, because they're so much faster to execute than public key cryptography.
Right.
And I don't know where I'm going with that, other than the lesson to be learned is that it's not the algorithm per se, although there are attacks against the algorithms. Usually they're brute force attacks.
Yep.
DES was broken because of distributed processing. They defeated...
There's theories it was broken on purpose so NSA could spy on... That's where the book goes.
Whatever. I'm not
Jeff
go
is
there.
not saying this, right? But that's where the book is going, that it was broken on purpose so that NSA could spy on people. That's the kind of conspiracy kind of theory.
Yeah, I'm not going to go down that road. But all that to say is algorithms are typically, can you do the brute forcing? There's throughout history, even when it was machine cryptography, before it was digital cryptography, the cryptographic attacks were typically brute force. The Turing machine was just brute forcing. I mean, and they had some cryptographic tricks where they got a little bit of they knew what the Heil Hitler thing, they knew what the beginning of the message was, so that was a starting point, and that was a cryptographic attack. It reduced
the key space, basically,
or it gave you some knowledge of the way the Enigma machine was. There was a series of rotors, and you could figure out very quickly what the initial settings were.
And Ed Scotus has one, which is why you mentioned that when you visited Ed, it was like a cryptological...
Well, he has
museum.
an Enigma machine. He's got various crypto devices, he's got Russian rotors from different... He's got all sorts of cool stuff.
He's a crypto nerd. He's a crypto nerd. Maybe we should bring Ed on to fully unpack
not for the Christmas hack, but for the holiday hack. Have him talk about crypto. We should do that.
Yeah, for SSL, because I always kind of thought it was interesting that if you were to do like a man on the street interview, a person on the street interview, if you were, and just ask random people like, "Hey, you work in security. Like, how does SSL work?"
Nobody knows.
Few people know. It's a hard question to answer. It really. That was what that book kind of turned me on. Like, that's a really hard question to answer. To be able to answer that in English terms that people can understand. But then there's a subset of people that can actually understand the math behind that as well.
Yeah, and that's a good point, because the math is lost on most people. It's lost on me.
When I was reading the book, they were talking about the early papers, and I started Google searching for what were the early papers on the Diffie-Hellman key exchange, on the RSA algorithm, and you read the first paragraph. And then the next section goes into all the mathematical formulas. I'm like, holy crap, I'm lost already.
Right. Which, if we can loosely transition back to the news stories.
Yes.
You had an article about quantum computing. Quantum computers are coming. Get ready. What quantum computing does or will do eventually with public key cryptography is it enables the fairly quickly solution of that, factoring the prime numbers.
Right.
So it blows up public key cryptography completely.
Because you can do enough math to reverse factor, for lack of a better term. That's not the right term, but reverse factor.
Solve it, decrypt it, crack it, whatever you want to break it, whatever you want to call it.
You can do enough math to
Ironically, what it doesn't really give you a leg up on is traditional symmetric algorithms, where it's just one algorithm with one big huge key. Because there is no factoring involved. It's you've still got to brute force it, and it's still gazillion possibilities.
So we could go back to symmetric key cryptography and be safe.
Well, that's the challenge, and the challenge is compounded because symmetric cryptography is it's faster, but how do you
operationalize that?
How do you distribute a single key to
how do
everybody?
I give you that key securely?
Right.
Yeah.
Especially when you're trying to do like a website and you want to have all your millions of users be able to do secure communications, secure web sessions. That's the problem that's and hats off to all the people that are trying to solve the problem, because there's a lot of organizations. NIST has had an open call for 3 or 4 years now to come up with new algorithms that are fast and work operationally. They're practical.
But interesting how that impacts cryptocurrency as well, which still uses that Diffie-Hellman style key exchange in the cryptocurrency, right? There's still a public-private key aspect to that cryptocurrency. From when I get the high level description of how that works, like I'm like, oh, it's still using like Whitfield Diffie must be like, that's pretty amazing that they're taking what I developed, 40 years ago now, or 30 years ago or whatever it is, right? And when did he develop that? It was in the 70s. It was in the 70s, right?
You were 40, 45 years ago. Yeah.
Yeah. And now applying it to currency, which must be a pretty amazing.
Yeah. But somebody will come up with a solution for it. I'm old school. I'm paper one-time pads.
Yeah,
you can't break them, but they're not practical to use. One-time key. Although there was several years ago, I was at RSA. I think it was RSA, and I was just walking the trade room floor, and I came across a company that was talking about doing one-time pad encryption for data storage, and they were using lasers to create the one-time keys. I'm like, I'm intrigued by this. I'm going to stop and talk to these guys. And of course, the people at the booth had no idea what I was asking. They're like, but the physicist that designed all this, he's here. He can talk to you. So we had a conversation.
That was a revelation that John Strand, Ed Scotus, and myself were at dinner at RSA. We were mentoring students. But Whitfield Diffie, and I want to say it was Revest, was in the same room, and we kind of looked at each other like, you guys should go talk to those guys. They invented like these cryptographic algorithms that we use today that enable e-commerce and all these things. We're very humbled to be in the same room as some of these folks.
And we forget that as especially in the hacker community, we like to go on and on about how we break things, but try building something that can't be
creating
broken.
Those out. It was an amazing story to me. Yeah.
But I guess the point that I would make as an aged manual cryptographer is, and I see this in PCI all the time, because PCI has requirements to encrypt data.
Yep.
But they also have a lot of requirements, and they're somewhat dated because they're written in the context of the way we used to do cryptography, let's say. But it's all about key management and key distribution, and it's protecting not the data, not the algorithms, but it's protecting the key. And man, that's really hard to do.
Yep.
Nation states have a hard time doing it well historically. Of course, NSA did it really well. But even NSA realized that you can have the best algorithms and the best designs, but it all falls apart in implementation if you're not doing key management and key distribution. The Russians, back when I was at NSA back in the late 80s, there was a famous espionage case, two guys named Walker and Whitworth. They were selling the keys to the Russians for like 10 or 15 years. And the only way we found out about it is one of them, I think it was Walker, was going through a divorce, and his wife blew the whistle on him.
I think I remember telling that story.
That's how it was discovered. So, if it wasn't for, if he had been better at taking care of his wife, who knows how long it would have been gone. And all the safeguards, all the protections, all the lessons learned by NSA over the years about how to protect and secure data and vet your people, it was all blown up because somebody just said, hey, I can sell this and make money.
On a lighter note,
I don't
know if you read the story, the funniest quotes about cybersecurity and tech. Two of my favorites from this one is from Brian Krebs.
Mm-hmm.
And Brian says, I've come to the conclusion that if you give a data point to a company, they will eventually sell it, leak it, lose it, or get hacked and relieved of it. There really don't seem to be any exceptions.
Yeah. I haven't had a chance. I want to dig into this because who doesn't like funny quotes?
Right. William Peterson said, whoever said that the definition of insanity is doing the same thing over and over again and expecting different results has obviously never had to reboot a computer. Again, it's one of the lessons I've instilled on our intern is that, sometimes to make shit work, you just got to reboot it.
Right.
Seriously, dude. He's like, I'm actually kind of amazed, how often that still works today. Just rebooting it is all you need.
Well, I was speaking of rebooting when we were talking to Scott in the first segment,
mm-hmm.
And he was talking about what's involved in the firmware attacks. I was remembering the countless times that I was at a customer side, a retailer, and I'm looking at the point of sale system, which is running a payment application, and it's all locked down, and all the
mm-hmm.
cash register clerk can do is log in, and you can't break out to the operating system because it's all contained. But I would have them reboot the thing, and it was running on, back in those days, it was probably running on Windows 98 or 95, mm-hmm. or maybe it was 2000, or maybe it was the XP. But the systems, which were running on older hardware, would take maybe 20 minutes to reboot and mm-hmm. boot up. And all that time, I can just halt, and I did. I interrupted the boot sequence, and I was on as admin.
Right.
And I could do anything. And, you had to be there, but, how many, large retailers that have lots of checkout counters, or they have something in the back, think a grocery store where they've got the deli counter, the florist, the baker,
mm-hmm.
Maybe they have I'm blanking on, the people that will do the parties for you, the party platters and stuff like that. The catering. Thank you. All these other people have the same systems that aren't out in the front where the video cameras are to make sure that the clerks aren't pocketing money and stuff like that. Lots of opportunity, and really not a good solution to fix that. You just had to kind of hide your head and hope.
One of the philosophical quotes from this article is from Steve Wozniak. Never trust a computer you can't throw out a window. That's very philosophical.
That is philosophical.
Yeah,
I like it. If you spend more on coffee than on IT security, you will be hacked.
Yeah.
And that reminds me of, I had a customer in my early days in the private sector that we would go to their, I'm not going to name the client, but they were a philanthropy, and they had lots of money, and they would invest the money in various types of research efforts and stuff like that. But you'd go to their headquarters, and the artwork that they had on the walls, they had really, really expensive artwork. They would bring in European chefs to cook in the cafeteria. I loved going there, and I always made
awesome.
always made sure we had to take a break for lunch because the food was amazing. But the money they were investing in all that stuff, and they would have people that were getting the grants. They basically operated a hotel. They had a rat skeller. They literally had a rat skeller on the campus, and I'm like, all this money that's invested, and we're arguing.
What's a rat skeller?
A rat skeller is the one that I know about the most is at the Hilton hotel in Louisville that I always used to like. It's in the basement. It's kind of like a speakeasy.
Yeah. Okay.
But just a big banquet hall, but kind of dark and kind of look like you're in a crypt or something like that. This one at this
it's kind of like a club. There's one in Rhode Island. There's a restaurant called the Rathskeller.
It's an exclusive club.
Yeah, but in the yard they have all these games they've got I don't know if it was when we throw the sacks in the cornhole. Yeah, games like that in the back. It's kind of, it feels like a club.
There's varying degrees of it. This particular place, it was walnut paneling on the walls.
Yeah,
it was a very, like your ideal cigar club lounge. Kind of overstuffed leather chairs everywhere, and a bar, and the best liquor that you could find, and they invested so much money in that because they wanted to, the people that were getting grants were, university researchers and stuff like that, and they would bring them in and wine them and dine them and make them feel comfortable. But and that's an extreme example, but there's countless examples of money that's spent on things that don't really matter from our perspective,
right?
And yet you struggle to get the budget to do the hygiene things, yet alone buy any security solutions. I like the one too. Someone cracked my password. Now I need to rename my puppy.
Yeah, yeah, right. Kiwi SDR. I want to circle back with Larry on this one to see how popular this one is. I've not used Kiwi SDR, software-defined radio, right? But basically, a few lines of code allow the developer to remotely access any device, enter its URL in a browser, append the password to the end of the address, and basically, you get access to the web interface. Wow. Like a very traditional backdoor. If you watch the videos in this article of the demos, in the interface, there was like a thing where you could run commands and basically execute operating system commands, like on Linux, like just run all kinds of commands.
That's really old school.
Yeah. And this backdoor persisted for some time and not only allowed you to change the configuration of the SDR, regardless of what hardware was running, Raspberry Pi, whatever, BeagleBoard, which is another hardware platform, but allowed you to access the underlying computing device that it runs on, like essentially remote command execution, as well as like do anything that the configuration could do with SDR, software-defined radio.
I haven't read the article. Did they conclude or even hypothesize whether this was an intentional
That's what I was wondering. Yeah. I couldn't find that in the article. I didn't read it like in any great detail other than to like see some of the demos, and I kind of skimmed through it. I believe this came from Dan Gooden from Ars Technica. They didn't kind of make it, as far as I could tell, didn't make any speculation as to whether or not like this was intentional, or it kind of seemed to me like they just put this in as like a debug kind of feature and forgot about it kind of thing. Like
very common.
I developed like an initial version, like I'm just going to code this in and
forgot to rip it out.
And forgot to rip it out.
Or conveniently left it because, when people are having problems, they want quick access and they want the problem fixed, and this is the easiest, quickest way to get in. I mean, I don't know how much it persists these days, and I haven't done technical hacking in many years, but that was very common in the early days where we weren't really exploiting anything. We knew about the features that were unpublished and things that gave remote access in particular, and this is very reminiscent of that.
That's kind of creepy. So if you do run that software, make sure they did fix it. And remove the backdoor.
Does it require a firmware upgrade?
No, this is like software that runs on a device that has a software-defined radio device attached to it, right? So you'd get a Raspberry Pi, put an operating system on it, plug in the software-defined radio, and then run this software that interfaces with the hardware.
I had brought up the article. I don't know if you had a chance to dig into it. What was the title of it? Stop huffing about cyber retaliation.
I saw that.
Did you get a chance to read it?
I didn't read it, but I saw the headline. Oh, let me refresh. Is that in one of your stories, Jeff, or?
I didn't have any stories.
Oh.
It might have been one of Lee's.
I did see that. Which story is that of Lee's?
Search on huffing.
It's BC.
8.
his story number 8.
Story number 8.
Ransomware getting leaked sensitive information from 6 universities.
Maybe it was your story number 8.
My story number 8. Yeah. Stop huffing about cyber. Yeah, I did see the headline. I didn't dig into this story.
Oh, well.
Oh, well.
We'll read the article.
Yeah, retaliation is really interesting. John Strain and I have talked about this like so much. Like, you can't really, I mean, can you hack back? Can you not? Like, it comes down to attribution and all this stuff. And with all the talk about ransomware, the inclination is to go, well, we just need to like retaliate. But like, who are you really retaliating against?
Right.
And doing that attribution is so hard.
Well,
you get into international laws.
I guess I would say, and I'm certainly not expert on this or read up on it, but some things like retaliation are best left in the hands of the professionals.
Yeah.
Which in this case would be the DOD. And
John and I, Strand and I, are really of the opinion, if you're going to do that, work with law enforcement.
Yeah.
Help law enforcement. Have law enforcement help you. Make sure you got your attribution down. You know, I think Microsoft has done a good job of the retaliation in taking down botnets, right? But there's a tremendous amount of research and collaboration that needs to happen before it culminates in, we're going to take down this botnet, right? And you have to do all of that due diligence before, like, you can't just go in your logs and go, oh, like, this person's attacking me, so I'm just going to take them down, right? Like, there's a lot of coordination, a lot of research that has to happen before you do that. And the question we've talked about a lot lately is it physical retaliation? Is it cyber retaliation? Is it a combination thereof? And that's tricky. Very tricky.
it's the end of the article. It says, postscript, my wife, who has an eye for understanding human nature, offered this astute observation on a key psychological dynamic at play when someone is suddenly exposed to the bleak, albeit banal, reality of how pervasive intelligence controls actually are. And I don't know what she said because I need to refresh. But I think what the article was getting at is essentially what we were getting at, is that
it's not simple.
It's not simple, and it's not something that you should. Maybe if you're a big organization, you do it, but
in collaboration with law enforcement.
In collaboration with law enforcement.
You don't want to create an international incident either.
Well, what you're doing is illegal, regardless of what your motivation is, and you could end up getting in trouble. So yeah, you want to.
You can violate the CFAA yourself if you retaliate, right?
So it's not certainly anything that I would ever recommend. I think that's my position.
Yeah. The code. Do you remember the code Red Worm?
Yes, I do remember that.
I thought it was. This is a kind of a positive thing for me, right? The article from I think it was Sophos Security, right? Was the code Red Worm 20 years on? What have we learned? The article really didn't talk about what we've learned so much as describing the history behind code Red, but they did see something interesting in that if you can find a stack-based buffer overflow, back in the day, it was very, very little work, maybe an afternoon's worth of work, to weaponize it, use the paramilitary terminology that cybersecurity seems to like, and turn it into a workable exploit that could basically break in on any similar Windows system. I think it's props to Microsoft, many other software providers that have raised the bar, right?
Right.
Although we talk about the printer exploit, I did have a Twitter kind of thing that talked about weaponizing, that. I don't think that's a blanket statement, but in general, large software vendors like Microsoft have made it much harder to weaponize and exploit a vulnerability. When we think back to Code Red, it was the reason why Code Red spread so fast, because there were very little protections. There was a very glaring buffer overflow exploit.
Right.
And even if we have that today, there are protections that help us, but not in every case.
But it goes back to what I was saying earlier. Even though they're rarer these days, more complicated, it still boils down to, can you detect it and respond to it
And patch it.
and patch it, or just address, stop the people from doing it. Yeah.
Also, Microsoft discovered a threat actor targeting SolarWinds ServeView FTP software, which I thought was interesting because when I worked at university, ServeView was a ripe attack surface. Like attackers were using it as software to distribute wares back in the day, and ServeView was very vulnerable at the time. And I think it's interesting that we fast forward 20 years. And people are still finding new attack vectors in it, and somehow it was tied to SolarWinds, which is interesting. It just SolarWinds make ServeView. Again, this was one of the ones I didn't dig into in any great detail.
They probably acquired it.
Yeah, who owns ServeView software?
I don't.
There was a 0-day exploit in it. It just brought me back. Oh, yeah. SolarWinds, FTP software. Yeah, SolarWinds distributes the software. Yeah. Kind of interesting. It was a throwback. $528 per server, according to SolarWinds, to run vulnerable software. Imagine
that. So what have we learned today, Paul?
Lots of stuff. Great show. Good interviews, good news stories. So, Jeff, thanks for coming in studio, being here with me. Thanks everyone for listening and watching this edition of Paul Security Weekly. That concludes the show for tonight. Over and out.